With the Underground Railroad. And we're going to have a wonderful series with wonderful presenters. And so I'd just like to share just a few of these with you. Obviously tonight, Monica will be making her presentation, and Jannie's going to introduce her in just a few moments. But next week, Angie Snook, curator of the museum here in Geneseo, she's going to be talking about what the diarists say about their own experiences that made them such passionate abolitionists. And then the following week, she's going to talk about what living was like as an abolitionist in Geneseo. And then on the 7th of April, we're going to be looking at whether the Underground Railroad sites are still standing. And my understanding is that we might be invited to someone's house to look at a hiding room. And if the weather permits, we'll take a tour. And if not, I guess we'll do our virtual tour anyway. So I want to thank Angie. And Angie, do you mind standing up? I know most people here know you, but there's some that might not. She's one of the most enthusiastic, exciting, passionate people. This is her passion, and I know she makes wonderful presentations. And then the last program, which will be on April 14th, will be presented by Dr. Owen Mulder from Knox College, and he's the author of the book, The Underground Railroad in Western Illinois, and he's currently at work on another book, and has a wealth of information. Again, he's spent many years studying the Underground Railroad. So anyway, I want to thank you for coming. Following our program up here in the sanctuary, we're going to meet. You're invited to go downstairs into the fellowship hall where we have plenty of refreshments and time for fellowship. If you need assistance getting down, we do have an elevette in the back of the sanctuary here to assist you to go downstairs. Otherwise, you're invited to take the stairs. So anyway, again, thank you for coming, and now I'll ask Jannie to come forward.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to see a full house. This is awesome. Well, it's my privilege to announce that Monica Casaro and her friend is here because I went to high school with both of them, so it's so great to see them again. She is going to talk about what motivated the settlers to come to Geneseo and start the church and the theology of it. So I'd like to welcome Monica Casaro. She's from Seattle, Washington. She has a church out there. And she's been a 5-year generation of Geneseo and grew up here also. So I'll give you the floor.
Thank you all for coming out on your Thursday evening, and let us remember that this is the season of Lent. We are remembering that this is our journey where we get closer to God, get closer to why we are and what we do, why we do what we do. So it's very appropriate that we get to talk about our founders. Now, for me personally, I don't go back to 1836, but I go back to 1858. I'm a direct descendant of Nathaniel Resser. So if there's any Ressers in the house, we're related. And Nathaniel Resser had 13 children. So we're out here somewhere, everywhere. Kings, Ressers, and then all the many other names that came about. As Bruce said, I want to personally thank my friend Angie Snook. She and I have been on this journey to figure out who we are and why we are. And Angie likes to say we've been doing it for 10 years, but I like to say we've been doing it for 4. But yeah. And so I'm going to talk to you tonight, what happened before the people arrived? It wasn't just in May of 1836 they decided to get into a wagon and then got here in September. So I'm going to talk really fast, and if I'm going too fast, raise your hand, and I might stop. The Christian disciples of the Geneseo colony, first of all, we need to know this. They abhorred slavery, they practiced temperance, and they honored the Sabbath. And as I like to say, I wouldn't party with these people, but I would definitely fight with them against the abhorrent practice of slavery. They founded a church, a manual labor school, and ran many stations of their Underground Railroad, all because of their revivalist understanding of God. These people, because of their faith, left everything they knew to go to an unsettled place that no one had lived in before. Because of their unflinching faith in a just God, these Geneseo colonists risked their lives to live out their beliefs. In seeking to tell this story of those who founded Geneseo, Illinois, let it not be lost on us that Geneseo was not unique, at least in western Illinois, what was then called the Military Tract. These Christians had a strategy, they had a means, and they had a goal. The goal was to settle the American West with their kind of Christianity and to end slavery. Because these actions of these devout Christians, the United States Constitution changed. The United States first had to go to war, and we had 315 men who went off and fought in the Civil War. My great-grandfather, Nathaniel Resser, being one of them. They went off, or their children went off, but in the end, because of their perseverance, we gained the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments of the United States Constitution. And now, I ask you all, because of your faith, what would you do? Would you be able to leave everything you knew, not just for a moment, but to lead a lifestyle of risk, living outside the civil laws? That's the question the Geneseo colonists asked of themselves, and their answer was yes. We believe that these civil laws were against God, and our answer is to break these laws. According to the writings of past historians, not a Geneseo colonist was caught in aiding and helping a fugitive slave. And as can be researched, the town as a whole at this time was an active movement of harboring slaves from 1836 until 1865 at the end of the Civil War. Even after the end of the Civil War, we were still active in the movement. We then this church sent missionaries down to the Deep South to teach in what they called slave schools at the time, to teach children who had been slaves, to teach them how to read and to write. And we found a great document, which Angie will be sharing, of an 18-year-old teacher who had a meetup with the Ku Klux Klan. But that's later. This project will begin to answer some of the questions, in particular, the theological context that motivated these colonists. Geneseo and its founders were part of the Second Great Awakening. They were not on the fringe of the evangelical movement of the day, but they were the leading pioneers of it. Although the founding of Geneseo is acknowledged and celebrated in the year of 1836, the founders were part of a much larger movement that was gaining momentum in Western New York in the 1820s and the Deep South of the 1830s, with direct connections to the Oneida Institute, the Lane Rebellion, and the Oberlin College in Ohio. Because of their deep faith and their salvific freedom, the founders of Geneseo left everything they knew in Bergen County, New York, to find what at the time would be a new colony. The main purpose of that colony would be found a church, a manual labor school, and begin almost immediately delivering fugitives to freedom. The histories of the Geneseo colony and Congregational Church are so closely interwoven, and I know y'all heard this line before, you cannot speak of one without speaking of the other, as we celebrate 175 years. Amen? Amen. Come on, people. Come on. Help me out. Help me out. The church was a court of justice. It was it was a place where you had settled community matters. It was a place where you settled family misunderstandings. At one time, in the early days of Geneseo, all but one, and most of the children were members of this church. And you know who that one was? A Methodist. Woohoo! Okay. For over 18 years, there were no other churches affiliations in Geneseo, not until after the railroad went through, bringing from those other denominations and also bringing foreigners of different beliefs. That's Elohim Taylor. The three families that comprised the first 26 colonists did not found Geneseo in a vacuum. They were part of the greatest theological movement of the time. It was the area of New York that was being consumed by revivalist theology and activism. Evangelists were going from village to village, awakening the people to the conversion towards God, and in that conversion, they would become part of the social change that they believed America needed. At the time, this was the most rapidly growing part of the country, and by 1825, New York's progress had come to be epitomized by the Erie Canal. In this chapter of history, we want to note that there was a dynamism, I can't even say it, dynamism, that it. And for youth in the region encouraged religious experimentation and enthusiasm. This is where the people who do seances, this is where they came from too. It was a busy time. This was also called the Burnt Over District. This came from the intense fires of revivalism that would sweep over entire towns and change them forever. This is the countryside, and this is the backdrop in which George Washington Gale, anybody know who that is? Angie Snook, you cannot answer? Galesburg? Galesburg, amen. Okay, good, listen to that name. George Washington Gale, Charles Finney, and Theodore Weld were all living in it, and actually, they were effecting change. In this time and place, 1820s Western New York, all three of these folks knew each other, all three would work together, and all three had direct effect on the lives of the colonists of Geneseo. The colonists of Geneseo knew the sermons of Finney, they'd been organized by Weld, and then in fact helped run the underground in Illinois together with Gale. One could say it was truly providential that all would be intertwined and connected. Amongst these fervent flames, a great legacy was born. As late as the 1790s, Western New York had been a wilderness, dotted with frontier outposts. Soon, however, substantial numbers of New Englanders abandoned towns in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont to make lives for themselves over the border in New York. We are related to the Puritans. Farmers, merchants, investors, lawyers, mechanics, and adventurers all delved into business of building livelihoods for the community. And beginning in the 1830s, ecclesiastical abolitionism, also referred to anti-slavery church reform, was a movement among evangelical activists. This reform movement called for local congregations to withdraw from their denominations and reorganize themselves into independently, locally controlled anti-slavery churches. These churches would be informally known as abolitionist churches. These churches were more than just places of worship. They provided cohesion for the communities. It was usually in these churches that the first regional and then the statewide anti-slavery societies were born. While these churches shared polity of both, these combination churches, Presbyterian, Congregational, and I hear you're now doing VBS together, right? See, so you're just going back to how it all began. Get it? Are you awake? You with me? Okay. Churches otherwise known as Congregational were run locally in a congregational model. That is, each church had their growing governing system and covenant different from another. But these same churches were Presbyterian in that they stayed connected to the regional bodies. This would be very helpful for the Geneseo colonists as a tool to keep all clergy and lay people connected in running the Underground Railroad. Each of these combination churches in Western New York adopted articles of faith, a church covenant, and rules of admission. The articles of faith were generally borrowed from established Calvinistic doctrinal guidelines, such as those settlers knew in New England. Those wishing admission to be newly constituted frontier churches had to meet with the elders of the church, be examined regarding the reformed doctrines of the gospel, and in their view and motives to Christian conduct. This unique alliance of Presbyterian and Congregationalists helped to ensure ecclesiastical order on the current frontier of New York and later the new frontiers of Illinois. I mean, can you believe it? You're really trying to think how you're going to survive eating the next day, but most important, you had to have your church law, okay? Because they did. Before they left, they created their covenant. The cooperative agreements before Presbyterian General Assembly and various congregational associations provided a basis for mutual home missionary endeavors in frontier areas bereft of available clergy. These same missionary societies would be the financial support for direct anti-slavery actions in the future. While not the only model, this was the model through the 1820s through the 1850s, and it was the model that Geneseo colonists used in finding Geneseo itself. And although widely used, it was not only Congregationalists and Presbyterians who were reaching the folks for Christ, but the Methodists and Baptists too. Okay, I'm going to skip that part. Anyway, so the Methodists and the Baptists, they were doing it too. This hunger for conversion in the 1820s and 1830s New York was a hunger to experience God personally, and it was believed by some that the only way to experience God was through the emotive process and experience. You were saved with God, and being saved by God was your ultimate goal. Western New York villages experienced this living and breathing ramifications of accepting God into their hearts and following a God's call, which now did not have to be linked to a denomination, but to a feeling. Although many preachers had been trained at Yale, Princeton, or Harvard, the people were demanding change. They wanted a little love. They were tired of the book knowledge. Are you with me? Okay. You're not acting like it. You're acting very Yale-ish, very Harvardish. It's okay to laugh. Okay. They did not want lecturing. They wanted to understand their scriptures, and they wanted their preachers to be extemporaneous, and they wanted to hear it straight from the heart. And indeed, a mighty force was coming upon them, and that mighty force was Charles Grandison Finney. And he's next, I hope. There he is. Look at that high forehead. Charles Grandison Finney was born in Warren, Connecticut in August 29, 1792. But it was October 10th, 1821, in a wooded area that Finney went to look for, listen to, and to argue with God. In moving to Adams, Finney, who had not been raised Christian, was fascinated by this movement around him, and he started going to the local Presbyterian church. And it was there that Finney met a Princeton-educated minister named Reverend George Washington Gale. Who was Gale? Okay. You're almost there. Okay. Although Finney respected Gale's education, he did not appreciate his preaching style. Finney called Gale's sermons discourses, and they disappointed him. The minister seemed to take for granted, recalled Finney, that his hearers were theologians. Meanwhile, Finney did begin to study the Bible with much vim and vigor. He was both fascinated and troubled with what he discovered in the text. He became painfully aware that he was by no means in a state of mind to go to heaven. Yet he struggled on. He went to prayer meetings. He continued to worship, preaching to the preaching of Gale, although still not impressed with his style, and stayed with the church another 2 years. The pressure inside him now had built up, and Finney felt he was at a crossroads. So in the fall of 1821, as the lawyer was making his way to his law office, an inner voice said, "Will you accept salvation today?" "Yes," he replied, "I will accept it today, or I will die in the attempt." Finney walked into the forest alone, and there he discovered a sinner. Finney sank on his knees, and verging on the edge of despair, he called out to God, "My heart is dead to God and will not pray." Perhaps it was too late for him, he supposed, but he did not move. He looked around to see if anyone saw him praying and felt remorse. Why should he feel ashamed praying to God? But it was not that. He was ashamed of who was doing the praying. He believed the sin that was in him was infinite, and it broke him down. As if atoning for his secrecy, Finney cried out, "What? Such a degraded sinner?" A verse of scripture came to mind. "Then ye shall go and pray unto me, and I will answer you. Then ye shall seek me and shall find me when you search for me with all your heart." Later, embracing what Finney would call the voluntary trust, Finney at last mustered the courage to pray, and he said to God, "If I'm ever converted, I will preach the gospel." Finney, for the first time, experienced God in his body and deep in his soul. "I could feel the impression," he remembered, "like a wave of electricity through me. It seemed like the very breath of God. I can recollect distinctly that it seemed to fan me like immense wings. I wept for joy and love. These waves came over me and over me and over me, one after another, till I recollect I cried out, 'I shall die if these waves continue to pass over me.' As he later told it the next day at the law office, a client entered at 10 o'clock reminding him it was time to try his case. Finney replied, "I cannot plead yours. The lawyer has become an evangelist, and the beginning of a theological crisis for the burned-over district had begun." Wishing to become an educated preacher of the gospel, he returned to Gale for doctrinal guidance and clarification. However, by now, the young lawyer had studied the Bible and spoken to God, and things that once had confused him now seemed clear. He found himself at odds with the minister most of all on the issue of salvation and in the stickiest of all questions. Who were Christians? Orthodox doctrine held that Christ, in dying on the cross, had absolved an elite elect of their earthly sins and automatically ensured them of salvation. Various aspects of the Puritan covenant theology tried to bridge these gaps between absolute unknowability of salvation and the natural human tendency to worry about such an issue. Signs of salvation might be found in the holy behavior of religious experience, but one could know for sure as the standards for power, success and virtue changed post-Revolutionary War America. The old signs had become less meaningful. In other words, Finney decided that to be saved, it just took some common sense and some democratic values and a transforming experience. He could not accept that Christ died only for some men, and this is very key, for only some men, or that even death ensured salvation for only one man. The voice of the Spirit indicated to him that the crucifixion allowed all men to be saved. Each individual might secure saving grace by repenting of his sins and giving himself to God. Do you see, if you understand that a black person is a human, they should have the freedom to actually worship God. Do you see how this is the core of where it all begins? Orthodoxy for Finney was misguided theology and a roadblock to the way of conversions. He did not automatically count as godly those already in the church. Just kidding. Okay. And nor did he abandon those considered by orthodoxy to be beyond hope. Like the first generation of Puritans and the New Lights, the Great Awakening, he saw his task as shaking the church to its foundations and bringing new converts into it who were truly saved. With Gale's recommendation, Charles Finney was examined for his license to preach in the St. Lawrence Presbytery, and as Providence would have it, most of the readers on his interview board were old school Calvinists, and they didn't much like him. But they put him through anyway. In his preaching, Finney eschewed theological vocabulary in favor of language for the frontier to understand. In his thinking, he wanted God to be accessible for all. When preaching, he dressed in a business suit rather than clerical garb, thus undercutting traditional symbols of hierarchy within the church. He aimed his sermons toward one goal, to make the stakes of salvation burn in the minds of his listeners. Accordingly, a staid Presbyterian church found itself transformed. Notice I picked on the Presbyterians. Presbyterian church found itself a meeting house for sober discourse. It was turned into an excited arena of conversion. Conversion, which had only in the past been for a select few, could now be attained by all who wanted it. Religious experience, which had once been seen as private dialogues between God and humanity, now took place in public settings, with men and women realizing their sinfulness before anyone who would listen. Not only did scenes within the church walls change, but the very definition of church expanded. Okay, imagine this on Geneseo streets. Okay, are you with me? Finney and his helpers pursued sinners in the streets, in the stores, and in the factories, and they sometimes even followed them home. No. Okay. And, not only did they pursue new converts with vengeance as they were saving souls, they attacked the churches from where they came from. The Finneyites did not hold back on their criticisms of the old ways of doing church. Young converts shouted to old school ministers saying, "You old gray-haired sinner, you deserve to be in hell a long time ago." That's kind of harsh, isn't it? But do you see the passion in these people? Do you feel it in your relatives? I'm just kidding. These previously unconverted souls, many of them youth, women, and others, were frustrated by the old ways of doing things. They finally found justification for unleashing anger that had been laid to rest just below, and now they tore off the garb of custom and decorum. To the new Christians of this revival, in this heady mixture of joyful communion and almost lusty vengefulness, those who stood in their way were literally doing the work of the devil. So all that is going on in all that previous slide. People were going from town to town. Charles Finney pretty much spent most of his days traveling around, and he's getting people. And so you got to believe that the Bartletts were there, the Stewarts were there, the Manvilles were there, the Cadys were there, hearing this evangelism that's going on, hearing this kind of preaching. So I just wish we would have had cameras of the early worship services here, because I bet they were a little more wild than they are now. If you can imagine where these people came from and who was speaking to them and how they were speaking to them. So our second person from this movement who came from there, I want to pass him up. Well, there's George. Reverend Theodore Weld. Look at his messy hair. Don't you love that? Theodore Weld, like Finney, was born in Connecticut. But unlike Finney, he grew up with less than feelings of being loved by God. Weld's father made sure of that. Weld's father was a Calvinistic congregational minister. Don't you like reform? Okay, that's just yeah. And in Hampton, in the early 19th century, the citizens' understanding of God and the relationship to God went something like this. Humanity stood depraved and nothing before the Lord's power. A few were saved, those were God's saints. And conveniently, the New England Congregationalists believed that they constituted the visible church of saints in the community for all others to witness, and that all others in the community were facing damnation. Do you know some people like that? Okay, next. Weld's father, steeped in this understanding, reminded Weld that he always fell short of God's love and mercy. So when Weld and Finney first met each other, both were very loved by their communities and famous in their own right. But Weld was haunted by insecurities of not being truly loved by God. It was this haunting that made him much more empathetic to the downtrodden, especially the slave, as he matured theologically. Weld's aunt was a devoted follower of Finney, and so she arranged, unbeknownst to Weld, to make sure he would get to hear a Finney speech, or hear Finney preach. Sophia, Theodore's aunt, knew her nephew did not want to hear Finney preach, but she's thinking he had to. She had a plan. And don't practice this here, no. She had a plan. She convinced Weld to come to the morning Sunday services with her. After hearing the regular minister preach, he then could decide if he wanted to stay for the afternoon session to hear the guest evangelist, Charles Finney. So along Theodore came. What he did not know is that Aunt Sophia, the evangelist, and the minister had consulted with each other, and that they had exchanged preaching times. Now, Finney was the morning preacher, and the regular minister would be preaching that afternoon. Finney, aware of Weld's view of him and also Weld's influence over Hamilton students and other people in the area, welcomed the opportunity, and he said, to slay the sinner. Aunt Sophia made sure young Theodore was in the middle of the pew, so he couldn't get out. Weld did not appreciate the forced listening. The next day, Weld ran into Finney at the store. Can you imagine at the country store? That's the new store, right? The country store? Coming up to Brother Bruce after worship and talking to him for an hour, saying what you did not like about the sermon. Don't you dare do that. And then Finney's response was, you are the son of a minister, and this is how you behave? Weld was stunned and embarrassed, and he fired out one last comment at Finney as he fled. Weld remembered years later, he just took my feeling and he showed it to me. He just showed it to me. Later that night, Weld went to see Finney again, and this time to apologize. The evangelist came down the stairs of the house where he was staying, and he asked of Weld, is it not enough? Have you followed a minister of the Lord Jesus to his own door to abuse him? Mr. Finney, Theodore murmured, I have come for a different purpose. At this point, Finney threw his arms around Weld, and body limp, sobbed and prayed the rest of the evening. For Weld, conversion meant an overwhelming sense of saving grace. He finally found release from all the many years of guilt and pain. Now he could openly admit to the people he led that he too was a sinner. He was now communicating to those around him in a much more intimate and authentic way than he had previously. He related later that now emotionally he was one of them. During this revival season of his career, that Weld took on the yeoman persona, dressing more like a pioneer than the member of the elite Connecticut family to which he was a part. No wigs for him. And brushing his hair before a speaking engagement was a detail that was a lot of times missed. At the young age of 23, Weld now found him the most trusted and closest friend to Charles Finney. Weld believed in the need to take responsibility in his call and his move to save the world in a direct and active way. The movement for Weld would be the Manual Labor School movement. In the search for spiritual enlightenment and real relationship with God, where does the body fit in? For Weld, it was integrated. You cannot just concentrate on intellectual and spiritual and ignore the physical. Throughout his whole life, Weld was obsessed on how to nurture the body, experimenting with diets, and sometimes in the process risking his own life, but always in the pursuit of honoring God in a holistic and holy way. In the 1820s, Weld pursued this holistic answer for him was the Manual Labor School movement. Simply said, the Manual Labor School movement followers campaigned for the addition of physical labor programs to the traditional curricula of theological seminaries. There seemed to be a great attention to the physical in this era, but not when it came to education. The American Education Society, for example, reported that many of its scholarship students had died from overstudying. I don't have that problem. They weren't sleeping, they weren't eating, they were just studying. And others had been reduced to the feeble state of the seminary routine. Things we could say. The age of energy was devouring those who would be its redeemers. In this situation, leaders of various schools became interested in the European experiences that merged manual labor with normal courses of study. In 1825, Maine Wesleyan Seminary had established an experimental program. Andover began an extensive workshop in 1826. The institutions hoped that the ravages documented by the American Education Society would soon cease as scholars integrated useful exercise with traditional study. I'm going to skip forward. Just to let you know where Weld was at a place called Oneida Institute. It was one of the first manual labor schools. The president of Oneida Institute, everyone think Galesburg was? George Washington Gale. Oh my gosh, they're together again. All right, people, just try to stay with me. By 1832, Weld had picked the site to what would be the National Manual Labor Institute. The institute would be called Lane Seminary. The new president for this seminary would be Reverend Lyman Beecher. Who could he be related to? That's right, Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's Harriet Beecher Stowe's father. He had 12 children. 9 of them were involved directly in the abolitionist movement. One of them, Edward Beecher, came to be the minister in Galesburg at the Congregational Church. Did you know that? Okay, good. You learned something. Okay. 1830, picked the site for the manual labor. This institute would be called Lane Seminary. As for George Washington Gale, he would soon lead Oneida Institute to start a new manual labor school in the wilds of Illinois. What was that school called? Knox College, which still stands today and is one of the foremost four-year liberal arts colleges in Illinois, as well as the country, and it's less than 30 miles away from Geneseo, Illinois. Do you think it's connected? Okay. So now we're starting Lane Seminary. The Lane students, especially the ones from Oneida Institute, not only brought with them a hunger for education and justice, but were already steeped in the manual labor school of life. This meant not only did they have a rigorous academic schedule, but they all worked the school farm together, ran the printing, coopering shop, and cabinet making shops. They also had very strict diets of temperance. Did not just mean abstaining from alcohol, but it also meant from coffee and tea. This shows how the manual labor system was the form of education and a way of life. The principle unwittingly helped ensure that students who attended Lane would be more dedicated, mature, self-reliant than those in other seminaries. The manual labor system had originated in Europe, and it became popular for several reasons. First, for combining labor with study, students were able to pay for their own education. Second, the healthful benefits of physical exercise were stressed. Third, manual labor presented a means of eliminating class distinction and acquiring knowledge of mankind. And fourth, manual labor was shown to be a way of inspiring students with independent character, originality of investigation, which belongs peculiarly to the self-made man and self-educated men. And in this case, they were all men. The force that led the students to enter a manual labor school in the West was evangelicalism. In 1830, Lane was not the only manual labor school of higher education, but it was the only one that included the fundamental principle of evangelicalism. The idea was to conquer the West with this particular kind of Christianity. It was a kind of Christianity that practiced temperance, honored the Sabbath, was manual labor, and believed in abolitionism. And it was fought for at Lane Seminary with vim and vigor. In 1834, events had occurred which moved the anti-slavery movement into the national prominence. Prudence Crandall, operator of an illegal school for black girls in Canterbury, Connecticut, had been imprisoned in late June of 1833. The American Anti-Slavery Society had been formed in 1833 and had announced its commitment to immediate emancipation. William Lord Garrison's Liberator had become the most offensive newspaper to Southerners and was being widely read all over the North and new Western frontier. The anti-slavery movement now had the attention of the whole United States. With the backdrop of change looming, Weld took his chance to mold the students that he had recruited to Lane to become immediate emancipationists. Most students at first arriving to Lane were of the philosophy of colonization, which had been the leading solution amongst abolitionists up till now. But Weld had been converted to immediate emancipation and now was going to use his celebrity to influence the rest of the student body and hopefully beyond. He was going to use his passion to change the minds of the many students who were at Lane because of him. He was going to make Lane Seminary the first academic institution in America that would profess immediate emancipation as a policy. In order to do that, Weld came up with the idea that Lane would have a series of debates on the topics, and in those debates there would be free discussion. Really, however, he had another plan. Remember, he's the nephew of Aunt Sophia. Remember her? Before the beginning of the debates, he would work to sway the majority of the students to immediate emancipation. And so when the evenings of the debates arrived, they instead would be a line of attack for the general pitched battle with the colonizationists. Weld reached out to his fellow students one at a time. The first student he worked with was with William T. Allen. He was an heir to a slave state. In Weld's words, Allen was the first noble soul who broke loose from his shackles. Together, he and Allen went to student after student to instruct, convince, and enlist the cause of immediate emancipation. Although a majority were still opposed to immediatism, those favoring colonization were also unsure of their support and asked for a postponement until they could be better prepared. The faculty members were approached regarding having a discussion on the pros and cons of immediatism and colonization. And at first it was reported that President Lyman Beecher's immediate answer was, "Go ahead, boys, that's right. I'll go and discuss with you." Later, at a faculty meeting called to examine the students' invitation, Beecher realized, or was made aware of, that there would be difficulties in debating such controversial issues, such as immediatism and colonization, in a region with a strong Southern ties. Oh, I probably skipped it. Lane is just north of Cincinnati. Cincinnati is a border city, right? You have goods and commerce coming up from the south, but yet you have people settling it from the north. So Cincinnati kind of has this very interesting place. And they actually are a very settled city. Chicago at this time is only about 2,000 people. Cincinnati is like 40,000. So it's the big city. That evening, Beecher presented to the faculty reasons why the students assembled in the prayer hall should not be having such a discussion. He said this would create and perpetuate a disproportionate interest unfriendly to the best of prosecution of literary and theological studies. It would cause unpleasant and permanent divisions within the student body. It would commit the school to a subject on which the community was divided. And because Lane was just forming its character, was surrounded by theological opposition, and needed additional funds, that's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? It all just gets down to money. Anyway, that's what it got down to. The school could not afford to offend a significant portion of the community. Their action, however, ended up being merely admonitory, and the students decided to go ahead. The public discussion of slavery is now known throughout history, called the Lane Debates. The Lane Debates continued on for 18 nights. You thought this was long. 18 nights. Despite the intensity of the topic and good-natured temperament ruled throughout, the spirit of the meetings was prayerful and inquisitive, with no invective or denunciation, even though 18 of the participants came from slave-owning families. One student involved in the discussions owned a slave himself. The first 9 nights were dedicated to the question of whether the duty of slave-holding states was to abolish slavery immediately. Weld opened the inquiry and held forth 2 whole meetings. William T. Allen then took the floor and told of the slaves the conditions in Alabama. Asa Stone, who'd been teaching in Mississippi, described the grim detail that was there. But what put the audience in tears was James Bradley. James was a man from Africa, formerly a slave, now free, and a student with equal standing with all other Lane students. He related how, as a child on a slave ship, he was sold to a farmer in South Carolina. But then that farmer was moving to Arkansas, so he was allowed to buy his freedom. Finally, the audience, they heard for the first time the horrors of slavery from someone who had been through it. At the conclusion of the first 9 nights, all except for 4 or 5 students who had not yet formed an opinion voted for immediate abolition. It is noteworthy, however, under the phraseology of the question under discussion, it was the people of the slave states who were to act. The remaining 9 nights were devoted to the consideration of the American Colonization Society, the question being whether doctrines, tendencies, and the spirit of the society were such to render it worth the patronage of the Christian people. There were several able discourses, but Weld surpassed them all. One student, John T. Pierce, nephew of Lewis and Arthur Tappan and future resident of Geneseo, Illinois, recalled that he was a staunch colonist when the inquiry began and would not even attend at first. I have no precise recollection of the debates, saving Brother Weld, Pierce wrote later. Weld was the means of opening my eyes. Weld, always the strategist, was content to have the Northern students and himself do most of the background work, especially at the end of the debates. He instead had the Southerners be the important leadership positions at the top. Oh, and at the top was William T. Allen. At the end of the debates, the men together established the first student-organized anti-slavery society chapter in the United States. William T. Allen was elected president, and on the board of managers was his brother James M. Allen. Okay. Because of these actions, both William T. and James N. participated in, because of their actions that they participated in at Lane, their lives would be changed forever. Because James was the more genteel one, he was able to return to Alabama. But William, on the other hand, was never could for fear of his own life. Weld wrote to his benefactor, Lewis Tappan, "We have formed a large and efficient organization for elevating the colored people of Cincinnati." Immediately, students started setting up projects all over the city. One project was a lyceum at which Lane students lectured to free Negroes 3 or 4 times a week on grammar, arithmetic, geography, and every other weeknight evening, they would teach Negroes to read. On weekends, there were 3 Sunday schools and several Bible classes. One of the schools they ran became so crowded that for several days the school had to turn away 10 to 20 persons. Weld related, if I ate in the city, so then we did a little skippage here. For Weld and the other students of Lane, the immediate emancipation of former slaves was not an academic exercise. Critics of immediate emancipation believed that former slaves would not have the intellectual, emotional, or physical wherewithal to live a life of independence and of freedom. Weld and the Allen brothers and others sought to prove the naysayer wrongs. That's why they led and started schools, but it went on further than that. They treated those that they worked with as social equals. And Lane, Seminary, and Ohio were not ready for that. Weld related, if I ate in the city, I ate at their tables. If I slept in the city, it was at their homes. If I attended parties, it was at their weddings, their funerals, their religious meetings, their Sabbath schools. Beecher did not see a problem with any of this. The problem he foresaw was the students would soon treat former slaves as their social equals. For instance, what was not acceptable to Beecher was when many students actually boarded with slave families. A number of former slave girls came out to the seminary in a carriage to interview their instructors, and one Lane student was seen on a city street chatting with a former slave girl. These simple acts of dignity crossed the line for many citizens of Cincinnati. As a result, resentful rumblings broke out in the city, and the Lane faculty convened a meeting to warn the students of the consequences if they continued this behavior. Beecher implored to the students, surely it is not necessary to treat the Negroes as equals. Hey, these people are taking their God talk seriously, aren't they? And it's getting them in trouble. Let that be a lesson. The students would not back down. Weld explained to Beecher that staying with former slave families wins the confidence of the people, and to make any distinction in social intercourse because of color was odious and sinful prejudice, and that someone had to move to advance public sentiment if any progress was to be done. Many more late nights of debate and discussion ensued between the administration and the students, and between Weld and Beecher, but with no satisfactory resolution for either side. The students kept treating their former slaves they worked with as humans, and the town surrounding their seminary just became angrier and angrier. Cincinnati seethed with pent-up prejudice, and now there was talk of organizing a march against the seminary. Beecher and the faculty took alarm and again called the students together, urging them to bide their time. They were right in their design, Beecher admitted, but they were too far in advance of public sentiment. The students appointed a committee, and its chair was William T. Allen. Their assignment was to consider the faculty's plea, but the students stood their ground. The students would not renounce the basic tenet of their enterprise equal treatment of all according to their character, regardless of color. The only saving grace for the highly intense standoff was summer break. For the next 12 weeks, many students would be gone, and the hope was that so would the faculty, and the excitement would die down that they were brewing. Beecher went on a fundraising tour to the east. See, if you're in trouble, the answer is leave. And that's what Beecher did. However, Weld and Allen stayed at the seminary with a few other key students, and they prepared a number of abolition papers and compiled a list of people to send them to. The students continued their work in the former slave schools, and on several occasions, former slaves would come to the seminary for consultation with their student instructors, and they were seen on the seminary grounds. Since many of the faculty of Lane had dispersed for the summer of 1834, the students continued their activities unhampered. But by August, all had changed. Lane's Board of Trustees had had enough of the students' blatant acts against their wishes. And so at a special meeting, the executive committee declared that slavery was not a subject for immature minds. In order that there would be no misunderstanding, the Board of Trustees had new rules published, and they published it in the newspaper. So it's like publishing something that happened here in the Republic to make sure it's, or the Dispatch, or whatever, right, the Arguing, and to make sure that the message got out. Talk about taking your dirty laundry outside, right? In order that there'd be no misunderstandings, every action Weld and Allen continued to pursue the risk of expulsion. But both being men of integrity and action, that would not happen. At the opening of the fall term of 1834, the students assembled in the chapel, and they sent a committee to ask the faculty to meet with them to interpret this new code. And again, both sides were at a stalemate. The Board of Trustees and the faculty stood by the decision that anti-slavery speech and activism could no longer be part of the Lane Seminary culture, and especially speeches could not be given on the topic without approval from the faculty and Board of Trustees. The students were outraged, for this stabbed at the core of the seminary and all institutions of higher learning. Where was their academic freedom, they asked. On October 7th, 1834, Weld withdrew from Lane Seminary and immediately enlisted as a full-time agent with the American Anti-Slavery Society. By December, 95 of the 103 students previously enrolled at Lane had left or did not return. Of the 95 who did not enter, 19 had left before the trustees took action against them, and one died. Therefore, the total of 75 students had withdrawn from Lane in the fall and winter of 1834. 51 of them had gone on record saying they had withdrawn because of the trustees' and faculty members' actions. And so, as history would have it, 75 students, including James Allen and William Allen, could claim that they were Lane rebels. William T. Allen, along with about 11 or other former students, went to a nearby village called Cummingsville. There they were allowed to rent a hall and hold discussion dedicated to the entrance of education, literature, and religion. Professors from other schools who agreed to taught the exiled students, and in time proved to be one of the greatest intellectual pursuits as well as a time of activism for the students. All continued their work in the former slave communities of Cincinnati. James Allen would leave the school and take a quick trip to Alabama and also to southern Illinois to stay with family. This trip would be a time that he would be preparing to become a land speculator, eventually buying tracts in western Illinois, which one day would be Seattle. No, Geneseo! Woo! So if the reader, which is me, or the listener is paying attention, that's you. Geneseo is directly related to the first integrated student protest in the United States of America. I know that's not what you wanted to hear, is it? Pretty cool, huh? Because of that protest, Lane Seminary went bankrupt. Right? That's right, because the people left, the student, and you can't. But there was another new school that was just opening up, and that trustee was out and about. It was also in Ohio, and he was out and about. He's like, oh, I got some students. Let's see, I have some buildings that I need to fill up. There's some students that need buildings. I'm going to go work it, and I'm going to go get these students and welcome them to my school. That school ended up being Oberlin College. Are you getting the pieces? The first person that they tried to wheel and deal to have become the professor of theology for Oberlin College, they wanted Theodore Weld. But Theodore said, nope, I'm going to be doing the politics. I'm going to be organizing the country. And hopefully, Owen Mulder will be talking more about that. And so he's out and about doing that. But who does he suggest to be the president? One Charles Finney. So we have two Allen boys that haven't finished their education. So they go to Oberlin and get to then learn directly from Charles Finney. And they become part of the first theological class of 1836 from Oberlin College. Now, are any of you getting why I keep bringing up these Allen boys? Anyone want to take a risk? Angie Snook, why am I bringing up the... Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. That's right. I know. Angie, we're having a moment here, aren't we? Okay. All right. Let me go to the stuff that you've all read before, I'm sure. One cannot talk about the history and the founding of Geneseo without talking both about the Congregational Church and the town. Like the founding of all those towns before in Western New York, Geneseo started its church with its articles of of Confederation and signing of the covenant. And remember, at one time in the early days, all adult but one, and that was the Methodist, were part of this church. The colonists were a direct offshoot of the crop of religious enthusiasm harvested by Finney in the burnt-out district. Finney's sermons, in fact, were literally packed in the suitcases of the founders. And they were preached from the first 6 months that our folks were here. And then Jairus Wilcox arrived 6 months later. He had been the colonist minister in New York, and it was he who first suggested to his parishioners that they go to Illinois for the sake of Christ. Wilcox had been part of a group of young seminarians at Yale who had dedicated themselves to the religious and educational needs of the new western frontier. The assignment the future colonists gave themselves while still in New York was to establish a manual labor school. So our school that we first had here was a manual labor school. And I'm going to argue that that is why at Geneseo Public Schools, at which Kathleen and I are a product of, I remember you had to take gym all the time. Does everyone remember that? I don't care if it's Illinois state law. I'm going to say it's a Geneseo law because my daughter now goes to school in Washington State and it is not a requirement. And we wonder why our kids are getting fat, right? That we're not honoring that it's a holistic education. And meanwhile, our people started out that way. They said, you can't just work on your mind, and you can't just work on your body. You have to work on your mind and your body and your spirit. So I'm going to say that we still all live that way here. Amen? Okay, amen. Here is Article 2 of the Standing Rules of the Geneseo Colony. We have to be very clear. Remember what I said way back in the beginning. This was an organized, very, very intentional community. We cannot deny that our people settled this town knowing that the acts that they were doing were illegal to the civil laws at the time. And if you understand clearly, you could not be part of the colony of Geneseo or be part of this church unless you agree to this church received no individual to its fellowship, but such as to believe that holding of their fellow person in bondage or slavery is a sin, and hence are willing to do whatever it takes to break every yoke. So in this one little article, not only are we going to hide slaves, but we're going to do everything in our power to actually act against it. In order to know where to settle, these future colonists sent out agents ahead to buy property. Now, this is the part we all know, isn't it? But hear it a little differently now. The exploring committee would be sent out to locate and purchase the land. The exploring committee was made up of Roderick Stewart, Cromwell Bartlett, and John C. Ward. I think we have them, don't we? You don't really get the sense that there's Lane Seminary, which is now gone. There's Finney Chapel at Oberlin College. Here is what we are part of now, right? Everyone sees the red bit. I know Angie has this map at the museum. I just was so happy when I found this. This says the graduates of 1836 from the theological department. So of this class of, I don't know, is this 15, 16? We have 3. Geneseo has 3. J.T. Pierce, William Allen, and James Allen. Isn't that pretty cool? That's just so cool. I think it's so cool. So when y'all are getting lazy, remember who you come from, right? And then there's the famous Brandenburg we're coming. And the Brandenburg Tavern. There's Roderick. Isn't he dashing? He looks kind of like you, Bruce. John C. Ward. Don't get on his wrong side. And James. Dashing James. So here we are. They come out. They were instructed to fix upon a site for a village and lay off the same into lots, which would be sold when purchasers might be found of good character and business avails to be applied to a manual labor school, to be for the present under the control of the colony. They were authorized to hire workers to build the first cabins so they would have homes when they arrived. And the Committee of 3 started their trip out west in May of 1836. They arrived in June, and now through further research, we realized there was a connection in Chicago. They met with Judge Ford, who would later be the governor. He advised them to strike for land known as Knox County, later to become Henry County. The land was rich and could be bought directly from the government for $1.25 an acre. That's a good deal, isn't it? Right? Yeah. The land could be purchased directly at the land office in Galena. The committee of three acted quickly on the advice given to them in Chicago, very interesting, and they went the area by way of the Rock River on Dixon's Ferry. The committee arrived at Brandenburg Tavern, one of the only businesses that offered housing and food in the area. And there the committee had some unexpected help. And who was at the Brandenburg Tavern? James Allen. Former Lane rebel James Allen. In that summer, now listen to James's story, the part you haven't heard before. That summer of 1835, where all the boys were deciding what to do, now they have a theology degree, and now what? Well, through letters to his father, William found he could not go home to Huntsville, so he stayed in Cummingsville. But James, who had not been as public as William, could go to Huntsville. And so in the summer of 1835, this trip would both be fortuitous for he and the future founders of Geneseo. James went home and upon returning realized that indeed his life had changed forever, and so would the country's. In his own words from his autobiography in the Geneseo Republic in 1923, he says at that time, "I went home in the summer of 1835 to Huntsville, thoroughly impregnated with the anti-slavery notions. I was looked upon by the proud, aristocratic people of that section as an alien. My visit home," that sounds like me. No, I'm kidding. "My visit home on the account was not the most agreeable. At that time, before reaching 21 years of age, I was fully convinced that such condition of things could not always exist in the South, and sooner or later the unnatural and violent relations existing between black and white would produce terrible disaster in some shape. Having heard of the rich prairies of Illinois, I said to my father, 'Give me $100 in money and I will go to Illinois.'" Okay. Allen went to southern Illinois, spent the fall and winter with his aunt and cousins in Carrollton. In the early summer of 1836, Allen's father came to Illinois and gave James M. $8,000 more with the order to buy Illinois land. By this time, Bartlett, Stewart, and Ward had met Allen. Allen was the man who knew the area, and he had the cash to buy the land. I love this. Okay. I think of, who was, Sam Houston? Tom Selleck. I think Tom Selleck should play James Allen in our movie. Don't you think? Because who could say no to that? Allen would relate later, "It seems to me now that they were very imprudent on trusting me with so much money in the hands of an inexperienced youth who had never handled so much more than $100 at once. Nobody ever objected or suspected me having such a large sum of money in my possession, probably. I managed to avoid loss and enter the good lands of Henry County, Illinois." Allen further relates, "My experience in Illinois was entirely new. My headquarters was the house of George Brandenburg in the so-called town of Dayton. He was a good man with an excellent life. Land was good here and could be found anywhere." And so, on that summer day of 1836, a relationship was formed between Cromwell, Stewart, Ward, and Allen, guaranteeing Geneseo, the new colony, would be a hub on the Underground Railroad. Amen? Amen. Amen. Okay, I'm done. So now we have questions. Are there questions? Gosh, I'm good. Okay, then I'm going to ask you questions. Who were the Lane Rebels? The Allen boys, right, were part of the Lane. The first integrated student protest in America. So when your kids are bothering you, it comes naturally, all right? We earned it. We earned it. You can read about the Lane Rebels. That's something you can find in history. So other Lane Rebels were James Birney, who ran for the Liberty Party in 1848. He's in that crowd. He was a neighbor of the Allens. And so when Theodore Weld went down through the South and was organizing people, that's where he saw slavery for the first time. And the Allens had as much effect on Weld as Weld had on the Allens, because it was the first time he saw it in action. And so every night they would have discussions, out on the back porch or wherever. And James Burney was the neighbor who would come down and have discussions with them. So James Burney, Liberty Party. Henry Stanton is another. Henry Stanton, married to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Okay, look her up if you don't know her. Very important in history. We as descendants of these folks, we are part of a national movement. It wasn't, again, so when you go home tonight, be very proud of where you live. It's not a mistake that Geneseo is here and that we exist and that we were founded when we were. We are part of this grand movement. And in the weeks to come, I think you'll get to hear what a big deal this is. Our people changed laws. And it's pretty exciting. And they did it because of their faith. Where I live in Seattle, people like to diss Christianity. So I always try to remind them, no. We have this, we have this, we have this. We can change the world. So this very particular, because not all abolitionists were religious, but our folks were. And they came here for a very specific reason. It was not an afterthought. And if you want to visit, well, I guess, Angie, you'll take them. William T. Allen is buried at Oakwood Seminary. Well, there I go again. Telling you too much about my life. Oakwood Cemetery. James Allen is buried at Oakwood Cemetery. J.T. Pierce is. If you ever want to see how we're 6 degrees of famousness, Amistad. Have any of you seen the movie Amistad? It's J.T. Pierce's uncle that pays for John Quincy Adams, pays for the defense. Theodore Weld wrote all the defense for that case. He was doing all the stuff behind the scenes. I mean, all these people knew each other. William T. Allen wrote the Lane debates, and you can download them, and you can, this is before MTV, so it's wordy, but it's really good stuff. Okay, any questions? Okay, all right, thank you all.
Thank you. I want to welcome you to the second of our. The topic, of course, is the Underground Railroad. Angie Snook, who's the curator of the museum here in Geneseo. And then Dr. Mulder from Knox College will be making the last presentation. Refreshments and great fellowship. And again, I'm going to thank you for
here without having to have a bench. I won't tell her that, but she is 4 inches taller than I am. There's not a better time or place for me to get to speak the next 3 weeks than this year, our 175th anniversary of the Underground Railroad, or in this church, which is our Founding Fathers Church, and something that I'm very passionate about and have spent since 1996 doing lots of research on. It's something I feel very strongly from my heart, and tonight we're going to talk about two of our founders that are some of the most important abolitionists in the United States. They're in the top 70. In fact, in Geneseo, there are top 2, and in the state of Illinois, James Allen was number 1. I'm going to tell you a little bit first about the strong anti-slavery element in Geneseo, the Underground Railroad. And many times they were half-starved, half-dressed, and very poor runaway people being sheltered in our attics and in our basements and in our barns at night. Elijah Stewart, who our Stewart Street is named after, He was one of our instrumental people, as well as Roderick R. Stewart, the Moranvilles, the John C. Wards, William Allen, Alfred Perry, and later the following year, the Hubbards, Hiram Cady, William Miller, Abram Miller, the Gilmores, Royal Wilcox, S.R. Bacon, George Richards, and the Reverend Jairus Wilcox, and the Jason Chapin, the father of the worldly librarian who taught here until her death. Let us cherish and revere the memories of those who builded better than they knew, and that's what our founding fathers said. That's not correct English, but I think it means exactly what they wanted us to know. There were many black codes in the state of Illinois and in the United States. And in 1848, Article 14 of the state constitution was passed prohibiting free persons of color from immigrating to Illinois and prevented slaveholders from bringing slaves into the state for the purpose of setting them free. That means our people were not only breaking the laws of the church, they were breaking the laws of the state of Illinois. I'm first going to tell you a little bit about James Allen, and I have a little bit of information about his family. His father and mother were the owners of slaves and living in a rich pro-slavery district of the country. They were anxious that their children should be industrious and learn how to work hard. Their slaves were treated with great leniency and were comfortably fed, clothed, and housed, but they still were slaves. Their sons, William T. and James M., were encouraged to go north to school, and the consequences of the early teaching at the home and the associations at the north were easily led them to believe that slavery was a curse to both blacks and whites. This was rather more than their father could stand for. Brother William was licensed to preach and spent several years lecturing on slavery. The writer hereof went home in the summer of 1835, which is James Allen, to Huntsville, Alabama, thoroughly impregnated with the anti-slavery notions. I was looked upon by the proud aristocratic people of the section as an alien. My visit home on the account was not most agreeable. At that time, before reaching 21 years of age, I was fully convinced that such a condition of things could not always exist in the South, that sooner or later, the unnatural and violent relations existing between black and white would produce a terrible disaster in some shape or form. At that time, he decided he needed to come to the state of Illinois because it was progressing in the anti-slavery move. He bound onto a boat in Tuscumbia and landed at Paducah, Kentucky, I can say that one, at the mouth of the Tennessee River. I went to Carrollton, Illinois. Then I found the horse that I had left there previously, whose name was Davy Crockett, and made my way to Henry County to the Brandenburg Inn. This is all from his autobiography, and we're very privileged to have his autobiography at the Geneseo Historical Museum. And I'm just choosing some highlights from it to share with you tonight. His father was a preacher, a Presbyterian preacher, and also a teacher. So James Allen's father, John Allen, had completely different beliefs than John or his son William. For 22 years, he taught his sons that slavery was okay. And when he was teaching in his classroom, he also noted slavery is okay. It's to be wanted. It's good. James Allen arrived in Henry County in 1835. He was born 11/23/1814. He died 12/20 of 1885. He did lots of many things in our county, and if any of you ever used to listen to my radio show on Channel 50, we used to kind of make Kurt Ford and Keith Kennett and I sometimes made fun of Major Allen because he had his nose in everything. No matter what was going on in Geneseo or Henry County, he was a part of it. Well, he was a good leader, and I have to make amends for some of the things I said. He was a leader in Henry County government, a first county clerk and the first county judge. He was voted into the state legislature in Vandalia when it was the state capital. March of 1837, he was chosen Major of Henry County Battalion, commissioned by Governor Duncan. Later, he was County Deputy, and then he was also the head of the Circuit Court in Springfield. He went back and forth between here and Springfield by horseback. He also became the first postmaster of Geneseo. In 1850, he sent to the state legislature and went and was most persistent about for getting the charter for the Chicago Rock Island lines. And this was for a very meaningful purpose. We thought, oh, isn't it wonderful? The real railroad is going to come through Geneseo. But Major Allen had already set his sights on that railroad, was going to solicit people to come here on the Underground Railroad, and they would have a much better means to transport the slaves to Chicago. Now, at this time, they were coming from the south. They were going through Galesburg, as Monica had told us last week. Andover was also part of the Underground Railroad, a few homes there. There were also some in Cambridge. There was also one stop in the Wethersfield area, but Geneseo was the #1 main hub. And when they got to Geneseo in the Cones edition and all our founders, they were #1. They all came here for one purpose, and that was as abolitionists to free the slaves. In this church, you will see by the summer, because I just found out there's a case that was purchased, the original covenant from 1829 to 1835 will be on display in this church by this summer. So you'll be able to read copies of it. You won't get to touch the real one, but you'll be able to see the covenants and how strongly these people believed in the Anti-Slavery Act. Most of the time, they went from home to home in Geneseo. There were many homes on the Underground Railroad. And Major Allen knew that we were getting close to having slaves caught in our community. So he went back to New York several times to try to secure funds to start the Chicago Rock Island line. And then he went to the state of Illinois legislature, and he petitioned them also to try to get the Chicago Rock Island lines. Now, how many of you remember when the Chicago Rock Island lines came through? Yeah. 1854, we had the railroad come through here. So he was very instrumental in two ways of getting people to Chicago by means of the Underground Railroad. Later, he became known as the father of the Hennepin Canal. He was also a scholar and a schemer at this movement, and he also wanted a waterway. He spent several winters in Washington, D.C., urging the legislature on its behalf. And he felt it was very important that we not only have a railroad system, but a waterway system. Now, as we learn later on, that the Hennepin Canal did not come through here until 1906 and 1907. So by that time, it was not of use of the Underground Railroad, and it was a very little use also of transporting goods from one side to the Mississippi River up to the Great Lakes as well. In 1839, he married a young woman, Susanna Stewart. And Susanna Stewart was Roderick R. Stewart's daughter. And they had 4 daughters. And the 4 daughters were also very much a part of the Underground Railroad. They secured clothing, they secured food, they secured medications. They were part of the Underground that was very important. The women of this church often cared for the people who got here. And by the time the slaves would arrive from the south, many of their feet would be torn. They would have soles of their feet ripped apart from traveling the riverbeds and the woods at night. So by the time they got here, it was up to these young women to soak their feet in warm water. They would take salve and rub into the wounds. They would cut strips of wool, only about this wide, and they would wrap their feet over and over again until it almost made like a boot. Now, I can't imagine putting wool onto the soles of my shoes when I have blisters and wounds, but the salve that they penetrated onto their feet penetrated into that wool, and in time, those became shoes for our slaves as they traveled on to the next free house. Later, we're going to talk about his youngest daughter, Sarah. And Sarah went on with Mary Ward, and that's next time's program. They became teachers in the South. And our slave children, who were now free, were going to be educated by the American Church Society. So these two young women from this church in 1900 and 1901 went to the South to teach these children. And I think you're going to find very interesting their firsthand stories, their first knowledge, they're all the truth, what they endured while they were in the South. And they also had endured working with the Ku Klux Klan. So that's just a little insight for next time. Also, James started the town of Richmond. Anybody know where Richmond is? Yay, we got a couple hands. Okay. Richmond is our first county seat. It's between Geneseo and Cambridge. If you go down 92 towards Cambridge, you'll see two rocks. One of them is the Great Sauk Trail. The other is Richmond. And he started his community there and the first county seat. But he also thought it was a good haven to help people getting from the Cambridge area over to the Geneseo area. Well, unfortunately, Richmond burnt. So the county seat at that time was then changed to Morristown, and then later in 1843 transferred to Cambridge. But he was always on the move, in the courts, in the legislature, fighting for our Underground Railroad and that all people would be created equal. He didn't feel that there should be a differentiation between the blacks and the whites. I want to read you a story because this is how determined he was. It also tells the fate of a good horse, Davy Crockett. Remember I told you he left his horse down in Carrollton, Illinois, and he picked it up back there and brought it here to Geneseo, to the Brandenburg with him? It tells the fate of his good horse, Davy Crockett. And he had first carried him from Alabama to Illinois. In December of 1837, I had an occasion to go to the land office in Galena. This time I rode Davy Crockett, a fine traveler, as I left the Brandenburg Inn through Prophetstown to the home of Robert Young, who lived on a farm which is now north of Morristown, which was then in Whiteside County. The weather was very cold, and the next morning, Mr. Young advised me 3 times, please do not leave my house. He said that the streams were high in the recent rains, that the bridges were probably gone in some places, and the mercury was way below zero. The wind from the northwest, and had the ride facing into it. But I had a sense, even though it takes to take his good advice, but after starting to go, I never yet stopped for wind or anything else. I found the wind tedious and very cold. 10 miles from Mr. Young's, I came to Johnson's Creek, a stream not over 10 or 12 feet wide. It was swollen and the bridge was gone. The bank seemed perpendicular. I rode up and down, hunting for a place to cross. Finally, I decided to get the horse in where the bridge had formerly forged the place. Davy refused for some time to go in, and finally I spurred him, and in he went, just like going off the roof of a house. I calculated to guide him by slapping him on the side of the head, the place where it had been the custom to go out when forging the stream. But it was upstream, and there was ice in the way, and the current was stronger than I had expected. So Davy turned downstream. I guided him very soon to a place where I jumped my feet on his back and then to the bank. Davy Crockett returned around and swam to me. He got his 4 feet up on the bank, and I got hold of his bridle by the bit and made a desperate effort to help him out. But his hind feet did not touch the bottom. I pulled off my mittens while helping him, and 2 of my fingers were frozen white. Wherever a drop of water touched, the skin was instantly frozen. I was wet to the waist, and my clothing was stiff as ice. It was then probably not more than 2 minutes since jumping into the stream. It was a dangerous place to stay. I knew my life was at stake. I left suddenly and ran 1 mile to the house. I made quick time. I was soon thawed out and comfortable beside a good fire. The man and his son went down to the stream to see if they could find my horse, Davy Crockett, but returned and said they could not find him. I always doubted their going to the stream at all. The wind was fairly cold and the mercury still below zero. The next morning was very cold, but then there was no wind. I went out on foot to Galena and returned on foot to the same house. The men had been down to the creek the morning I left for Galena and found Davy Crockett in the middle of the stream and his head resting over a log, frozen stiff, of course. I was to blame. I had been too headstrong again. Mr. Young had given me good advice, but I learned that fact by hard experience. I risked my own life and lost a splendid horse. I wrote to my father living in Huntsville, Alabama, and told him all the facts. His reply mentioned the fact that the horses refusing 3 times to go into the stream and said that if the rider had been as sensible as the horse, Davy Crockett would still be alive too. I love the story because I think it tells us the determination that James Allen had throughout his whole life, not just for the Underground Railroad, but that was part of him. Then he also went afterwards back to Springfield, and he wanted others to consult him in building a railroad that would go from Galesburg to Geneseo and to Morrison to also help support the Underground Railroad. Of course, we know it never happened. When he was a boy and he was in school, his teacher called him a dullard, and it bothered him very, very much. And he said it really hurt his confidence and it hurt his expectations to accomplish very much. And he said, if I learned anything, I learned not to judge other people. And he said, I feel all people should be taught that they should have hope to try and to persevere. Bright scholars in school don't always prove most successful in business or the professions, but some children mature earlier than others. Some need pushing forward and some need holding back. Teachers seem generally to expect every child to toe the mark. They contract a habit of paying special attention to the bright ones, becoming prejudiced against the dull ones. Their duty is to give special attention to the dullest. Some of them will unlikely become the smartest. I like his attitude. I was a teacher for 22 years. From there, I'm going to move on to his dear brother, William T. Allen. James Allen was here a number of years before William T. Allen came. He also was a Presbyterian pastor, and as Monica told us last week, he played a very important role in getting our people here to Geneseo. He went out into the woods, into the small towns, into Bergen and Genesee County, New York, and he found the people and asked them to please join his cause as an abolitionist. They did decide in 1829 that they were going to come here, and it took them until 1836 to start to make the move. They all came here with the goals of anti-slavery, and those are our founding people. I want to read a little bit about from his background about why the Allen brothers were so determined to become abolitionists. Then I will go back a little bit more on William T. Allen. It said, my brother also stated to me the following, which occurred near my father's house. And this is James Allen talking about the slaves near where his family farm was. And by this time, James Allen was living in Richmond, Henry County, Illinois. My brother also stated to me the following, which occurred near my father's home, and with sight and hearing of the Academy of Public Garden. Charles, a fine, active Negro, who belonged to a bricklayer in Huntsville, exchanged the burning sun of the brickyard to enjoy for a season the pleasant shade of an adjacent mountain. When his master got him back, he tied him by his hands so that his feet would just barely touch the ground. He stripped off all his clothing, took a paddle, bored full of holes, and paddled him leisurely all day long. It was 2 weeks before they could tell whether he would live or die. Neither of these cases attracted any particular notice in Huntsville, Alabama. Mrs. Barr, wife of the Reverend H. Barr of Carlton, Illinois, formerly of Cortland, Alabama, told me last spring that she has very often stopped her ears from hearing, that she might not hear the screams of slaves who were under the lash, and that sometimes she left her house and retired to another place distant away in order to get away from their agonizing cries. I have often seen groups of slaves on the public squares in Huntsville where we were sold at auction, and I have often seen their tears gush forth and their countenance distorted with anguish, seeing their brothers, their sisters, their loved ones all shipped away. Legal marriage is unknown among the slaves. They sometimes have a marriage form. Generally, however, they have none at all. The pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Huntsville, which we know who that is, John, their father, had 2 families of slaves when I left home. One couple were married by a Negro preacher. The man was robbed of his wife a number of months later afterwards by her owner. The other couple just took up together without any form of marriage. They are both members of the churches, the man a Baptist deacon, sober and correct in his deportment. They have a large family of children, all children of their concubine, living in the minister's family. If those statements are deemed of any value by you in forwarding your glorious enterprise, you are at liberty to use them as you please. The wrong of enslaving man, all the other wrongs are pygmies compared to that. Facts might be gathered abundantly to show that it is slavery itself and not the cruelties merely that make slaves unhappy. Even those who are most kindly treated are generally far from being happy. The slaves in my father's family are almost as kindly treated as slaves can be, but yet they pant for liberty. William Allen says in his last statement, "May the Lord guide you in this great movement. In behalf of the perishing, your friend and brother, William T. Allen." I'm sorry, I get really emotional over this. I don't know what would have happened if we would not have had these 2 men with their strong beliefs. When I talk to my grandchildren, I often tell them, you know, your mom and dad get real mad at you. These 2 brothers had to stand up to their parents. They had to stand up to the laws of government. They had to stand up to the rules of their church. Today, our parents probably think, oh, I hope my kids don't go out and get drunk on Saturday night. I hope my daughter doesn't end up pregnant. I hope my kids finish school. I hope they go to college. I hope they don't get in a car accident. And those are all major, major, major concerns. We all have those concerns. But can you imagine the mother and father who believed in servitude had 2 sons that took on the cause of anti-slavery? Now, I have to tell you, their mother did not care for the slavery acts of Alabama, but because she was a wife in a different time and place, she had very little that she could say about it. And she was the only one, when their sons would go back there, that would acknowledge them and acknowledge their beliefs. She also worked on their dad and said, you know, our 2 sons, they went out east. They were part of the Yale movement. They declared what they believed in. And when they come back here, you need to talk to them because they have sacrificed a lot for what they feel so strongly in their hearts. Well, William Allen came back here and rarely returned to his father's until the very end. He became a friend of the Lovejoy brothers in Princeton, Illinois. He went from one end of the state of Illinois to the other, preaching about anti-slavery movement. He went to Peoria. He finally bought a brand new suit because most of the time he didn't have the nicest clothes in the world. The first time he put this suit on, he got bombarded by tomatoes and potatoes, and his suit was wrecked. Well, that wasn't too bad, although he was very upset about it. He went down to the Tremont area of Illinois, was giving a talk, and he was nearly killed. So he took his chances, and if you all remember, one of the Lovejoy brothers was murdered in the St. Louis area. But because of their strong beliefs, they continued on. He also was part of the first anti-slavery newspaper in Chicago called the Western Cities, and he was part of that movement as early as July 13th, 1844. Today, if you walk across the street, you will see William T. Allen's house. Now, last week, Monica told us about the Chapin coming here. And he was one of our pastors. He was one of the strong believers. He was also one of the top 70. Well, Mr. Chapin's wife passed away. So William T. Allen married his wife and raised his children. He married her in 1846. In 1855, he went to the state legislature of Illinois. Now remember, his brother James is also part of that legislature. And he drafted a petition to the Senate and state representatives of the state of Illinois. And it goes as follows, and luckily I have a copy of it too. To the Senate and the House of Representatives of the state of Illinois. Your petitions, citizens of this county of Henry, would respectfully call the situation of honorable bodies to have laws of this state in regard to Negroes. We consider many of them just Christian, and that these statutes on the books are wearing and are permanent laws. Our petition is that you repeal all these statutes, which makes it distinctive between men because of the color of their skin. As in duty bound, we shall pray. All our founding fathers in Geneseo and in Henry County signed this petition. Better get a drink. William T. Allen became the village clerk from 1855 to 1859. He preached in this church when Reverend Wilcox went out east to get Jason Chapin and also Addison Lyman. For 6 to 8 months, our William T. Allen preached here in this church. And then later, in 1848, C.S. Cady came here. So I've got some stories about him next week, too. Both of the Allen brothers rank in the top 70 fighting for anti-slavery. Together, they convinced their father that slavery was wrong and he needed to release his slaves. They were not afraid to stand up for what they believed in. They defied their parents, the laws of the land, and their church, and they were dedicated their lives to stop slavery. I want to read to you the transcript of the last will and testament of John Allen, Huntsville, Alabama. In the name of God, amen. I, John Allen, the minister of the gospel of Huntsville, Alabama, do this day, the 17th of the year of the Lord, 1843, make and declare this my last will and testament in a manner that follows. First, I resign my soul into the hands of Almighty God, hoping and believing in the remission of my sins by the merit and meditation of Jesus Christ, and my body I commit to the earth. I also give and devise to my son James the tract of land on which he now lives in Henry County, Illinois. Also, I give and devise to my son William an 80-acre tract of land he may select of my lands in Henry County, Illinois, excepting that on which my son James lives. This bequest is made on the condition that my son William lives on the tract selected. If, however, he does not think it's proper to live on any of that land, then it shall all be sold in the discretion of my executor, and the proceeds shall be equally divided all of my children. And they did purchase all this land, all the way what we consider clear down past Chicago Street. Mabel, you should help me out on these documents. The best part of all, it is also my will that my Negroes shall be set free and sent to Liberia. I desire my executor to hire them out until sufficient monies shall be raised to pay for their passage and furnish the necessary outfit. It is my will that Cato and Robert and Sally be sent out first for the passage and outfit of the latter. I wish my executor to appropriate a sufficient sum out of the monies due me at the decrease, as I do not wish her to be hired out. I'm sorry, I have to go back here. My executor to appropriate a sufficient sum out of the monies due me at my decrease, as I do not wish her to be hired out, unless it should be to my son-in-law, Louis Wyeth, in the care of his wife. I especially commit Sally until she can be sent back to Africa. With regards to my servant Richmond, it is all my will that he be left on his own choice whether to stay here or to go. If he prefers the former first, avails of his labor in a portion to his support, he is not to be sold under any conditions. It is my will that Dolly shall be set free and sent to Liberia, as she is married and has some difficulties and may attend this. I must leave it up to her discretion and up to my executor. It is an indispensable condition of my setting of slaves free that they should all be sent to Africa, though I greatly prefer this because I am fully persuaded it is, in general, the very best thing. So finally, in the end, he joined his sons as an abolitionist. At the time of John Allen's death in 1843, his slaves could not be set free in the state of Alabama. So his sons brought 10 to 12 of them back here and got them to freedom. Old Richmond became James Allen's personal friend and personal person in his home. And he lived here until he was nearly 70 years old. And as a slave, he did not have a name, and Old Richmond was given his name by James' father, John, because of John buying the property for James, which he named Richmond, which is kind of hard to get across. So Richmond came here, named after a city. He only had one name. He had no birth date. He had no family. And at the very end, it says, Old Richmond was a kind and good soul. He was buried in North Cemetery. He was there 102 years. He was the first person buried in North Cemetery. He lay in his grave for 102 years, and Louise Bradley, which was the great-granddaughter of James Allen, in 1974 put a stone on that grave, and it says, Old Richmond, first freed slave of James Allen, and today you can go visit that. I get quite emotional over this. It's very important to me. And I always think of what it was like to sit here in this church, to sit here in this town, to have meetings and know that what was going on in your barns and in your basements and in your attics and in your hiding holes. And I often think, how do people have so much hope when every day they live in so much fear? Next week, we will going a step further. We will be talking about Harriet Cohn Miller. And the Cohn's Edition is just to the south of Main Street on the other side of the city park. Elijah and Alicia Cohn were conductors also of the Underground Railroad. I live in a house from 1854, which I know is also part of the Underground Railroad, and just a few years ago, we were having it replumbed, and we found a hiding hole that's very similar to the one in the museum. And I made my husband tear off some of the new concrete that was at the back of it to see if I could find if there was an entrance. And sure enough, there's a small wooden hole with a door that goes into there. I have no way of proving it. There's no documentation, but I know there's many other homes that will still be found out in Geneseo. Harriet Cohn Miller, we're going to do her story. She was a young girl who came here with her parents in 1836, and I have numerous stories to share with you about her. We're also going to talk about Sarah Allen, James' daughter, and Mary Ward, the first teachers who went through the American Missionary Association and the Ku Klux Klan. And we're also going to discuss Joanna and Philip Montgomery, Darlene Holland's great-great-grandparents who were the first freed black slaves brought to Geneseo by John Hammond of our Hammond Henry Hospital and Hammond Library. So I thank you for listening to me tonight, and I hope you'll come back, and we'll do another week next week. Thank you. fall off. And I'll keep it short. I was doing a program in Chillicothe, Illinois. I had given the program through the University of Illinois the first time in 2004. And I was invited back through Bradley University to give it a second time on our Underground Railroad. And as I was down there, I was eating at the Pizza Hut next door, and a truck came in with a Confederate flag in the back, and I really didn't think too much about it. Monica's heard this story before. And I went into the Historical Society in Chillicothe and started to give my program on the Underground Railroad. And two men that were in there started arguing with me, and they finally said, "It's people like you who ruined everything for us." And they still had very bitter, angry feelings. The man that was a professor at Bradley ended up calling the police. One man left on his own accord. The second one had to be escorted out. And it was the first time I realized there's some very strong feelings even today. On our trip to the South, which we're going back in October, and doing more research at the Underground Railroad Museum and through the Ohio River bottom and through Tennessee and Alabama, I forgot where I was going with this. As we were researching it last fall, I had a gentleman who told my husband as we were talking, he said, "You can tell your wife, the North may have won the fight, but they didn't win the war." So I don't know. I think I'll have to learn how to shoot a gun. No, just kidding. So any other questions? Yes. Yes, there were several close calls in Geneseo. I've read different points of view. One of them said that we did have a couple people caught here. The others have said that there were many close calls, but no one was actually captured. So I'm hoping that's true. Anything else? We had two routes out of Geneseo, and National Geographic did this for us in 2000, and both of them were going north out of Geneseo to the Rock River. The southern route was to Linden, and then Princeton, and then Chicago, and get on freighters and go into Canada. If it was frozen or frozen so the ships couldn't get through, they would cross the Ohio River bottom because Harriet Tubman had very much paved the way. The northern route, we went out to Geneseo again towards the Rock River. Then we went up to Dixon, Rockford, Minneapolis, St. Paul, which was just a territory. And from there, they would go into Canada. And in the rafters of the museum, they would take little sticks and burn whatever they were branded with into their arm, leave that symbol, and this might be something you're thinking about too, and they'd leave a sign whether they took the northern route or the southern route, so anyone that followed them on this freedom trail, if they were from the same plantation, they would know which route to take out of Geneseo. I've been asked this many times, do you think they ever found each other? I doubt it, but at least their intentions were good, and we can only hope that maybe a few of them did. Anything else? Well, those were wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. And again, we have a journey as we celebrate the 175th anniversary of this church and also of the town of Geneseo. And we thank you for coming out for these, what I think have been just very wonderful, insightful programs, presentations. And again, it's my privilege to invite Angie Snook to come forward as she's going to take us a little further on this journey of the Underground Railroad. So thank you, Angie. Oh, and while she's coming up, just one word of explanation. I hope you'll bear with us this evening. We just had some carpet installed down in the basement, and the carpet is still drying. So we're not wanting to drag any chairs, tables on the carpet. So we're going to have the reception down in our Sunday school rooms, get a little cozy. We have some chairs set up. Some will have to just mingle, and others who really need to sit can. But we'll ask you as you leave there, if you wouldn't mind coming through this door and taking the stairs down this other side, down into the Sunday school rooms. You can line up in the hallway too. That's where the refreshments will be served. So again, thank you for bearing with us. Next week, it'll be dry. Everything will be fine. So thank you.
That's fine. They've got my box up here for me this week, so I'm tall enough. Today I had the privilege of going to Augustana College to Centennial Hall, and Morris Dees was there, and he's a social justice lawyer. And last week I talked to you about about James Allen and William T. Allen and growing up in Alabama, and he shared with us just some enlightening stories about growing up in Alabama in Montgomery area as well. So it was a wonderful morning, and I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to hear him speak. And one of the things when I was driving home, it really inspired me to think that my big fat book of resources out there that I've been working on the last 14, 15 years is out there if anybody would like to look through. One of the things I wanted to point out is that what we tell you here is all documented, and I guess I say that every time I speak, but I think that's so important, and the research is so important. If you ever have a chance to hear Morris Dees talk, please make an effort to do so. Augustana, Centennial Hall, most of you have been there for one occasion or another, was packed full. There were so many people there of all different races and colors and creeds that it was just a tribute to the university as well as to our community. I'm going to start out with, after hearing him speak, I feel a little nervous tonight. We can't change our past, but we can influence our future, and I think that's what our series here is all about. And we've talked about the past and Major Allen and William T. Allen, and tonight one of the things we're going to discuss in the second segment is his daughter and what she learned through her family and the Allen family. But first I want to tell you about Harriet Cone Miller. Now I'm really, really excited about her. I found a land plot from December of 1837, and I brought it with. It's a copy of it in the back of the sanctuary. It's on one of the tables as you come in the entryway. And on it has all the original founders, where they lived, the places, the properties that they purchased in 1837. And one of them, directly where my house is at, is where Harriet Cone Miller's home was at the same time. So it makes it really exciting for me. Harriet Cone was Elijah and Eliza Cone's daughter. And when she was a young girl, she was one of the young women who really was let in on what to do as an abolitionist. And she had many stories that I had told for many years, but I hadn't had them documented because all I had was something in writing that I'd picked up at the old museum. And her one letter that she had written when she was 12 years old, and in 5th grade, she wrote, "I can't believe my mother would risk my life for people of another color, but I am so proud of her for doing so." And I thought, wow, what a statement. What a statement for a young girl to make, and not to be afraid to say to her classmates and stand up in front of a room and read this. Well, I've told these stories for many, many places, and one of the places I went to a number of years ago was the Rock Island Historical Association. And I was talking about Harriet Cone Miller and what an influence she had on my life and on my research for the Underground Railroad, for our community, and for Geneseo itself. And I got done giving my speech, and the little lady came up to me and she said, "Angie, I think I have something you might like." And I looked at it, and it was a paper. It says, "The Geneseo Republic, July 18th, 1913. And I folded it up and very kindly said, "Oh, thank you so much." Went back to the museum, opened it up. Harriet Cone Miller, in her 80th year, had been at the Rock Island Historical Association, telling firsthand of what it was like to come with the founding families of Geneseo. The story I'd been telling for many years to school children and to adults about Hidden in the Hay was now documented. And so the next morning, I called her up and I apologized. I said, "I saw 1913. I was thinking World War I or something." And I opened it up when I got back to the museum. And I want you to know I actually cried because you documented all of the stories I've been telling you. Tonight, I'm going to share with you some of it. It says, Mrs. Harriet Cone Miller, while recently visiting Rock Island, the daughter-in-law of Mrs. G.W. Miller, was interviewed by a representative of the Rock Island Union, and that her father was a keeper of the Underground Railroad. Its membership was scattered along certain routes of travel. They furnished conductors, conveyances, and places of concealment, food, and lodging. It is not known that there are any stations in or about Rock Island. The nearest known station was at Geneseo, Illinois, 25 miles east of the city in Henry County. Mrs. Miller was the oldest member of the family, and she was in her 80th year when she visited the Historical Society, and she is in full possession of her faculties, so we're glad to know that as well. Her memory of early events is very clear, and the recital of them is extremely interesting. She is a woman of exceptional talent and has done considerable public speaking. I came to Geneseo with my parents, but a little girl in 1836. Our family was part of the religious colony that emerged from New York, settled a place named after it. One of the articles of their creed was antagonism to human slavery, so practically the entire population of the town was composed of abolitionists. Our ideas of right caused us viciously opposed in some areas because they did not care for people who were connected with slavery, and among them were so jealous in their cause that freedom to give little heed to the laws, we decided we had to designate a place and perpetuate an institution. These radical and practical abolitionists organized in about the year of 1836 or 1837 and established the Underground Railroad with a station at Geneseo. My father was selected as its keeper. There was an L attached to our house in which was located the well and the woodhouse. Over this was an attic with a window and entered only by a trap door from the wood house, the opening being concealed in the construction of the building so that it could not be detected from below. Access to this loft was held by means of a ladder, which was concealed elsewhere. When fugitives arrived at our house, they were announced by a particular rapping at the door. The fugitives were conducted to the loft by means of a ladder and there concealed until opportunity came to send them on to the next station. As I was the oldest in the family, I was admitted to the secret, and it was my duty to take them food and water, and by means of a ladder and a trapdoor. And I well recall the cautions of secrecy I received, the other children being too small to be trusted with it. The fugitives came often in famished conditions, with clothes worn out and feet bleeding. They were supplied with clothing from women of this church as fast as it could be possible before being sent to the next station. These fugitives came from Geneseo from Henderson, the next station to the west, and were sent on to Prophetstown, the next station east, and their destination was Chicago, where they would be put aboard a ship. There were several stations between Prophetstown and Chicago, but I've forgotten where they are. One of the stories I told was about Hidden in the Hay, and this is the next article that was listed in her recollection of it. A young man by the name of Elijah Stewart, who was afterwards married to my younger sister, and who was about the time 19 years of age, was the conductor from Geneseo to Prophetstown. He, at that time, set forth and asked if this little girl, her little sister, who was only 6 or 7 years old, could be permitted to go with him on a hay and potato ride to Linden. And of course, as mothers today, we would never allow our little daughters to ever go with a strange man anywhere. But her mother knew very well that it was going to be safe, that the destination had a purpose, and said, yes, she may be on her way. They set out from Geneseo in their wagon filled with potato and straw, and she had no idea what was going to happen. And as they got over towards Linden, some Southerners stopped their wagon, took a pitchfork, and started ramming it into the back of the wagon over and over and over again. They were sure that there were slaves somewhere hiding under those potatoes and hay. Finally, she was so upset. She said, I want my mother. Why are these mean men doing this to me? Why can't I go home? Why can't I go home? And she became so upset that finally the Southerners said, I'll be on your way. You have nothing to hide. Later, as they approached a barn outside of Linden, there were two men standing by the barn door. And they opened up the barn doors, opened up for her to go in. One of the men helped her off the wagon, and underneath the wagon was a little trap door. They opened it up, and 3 slaves were underneath. She now knew the story. She was never allowed to go again, because if she were to be found by Southerners again, she might be so frightened that she would give away their secret. But her story went on, and her Hidden in the Hay is here. One of the things she also writes are that fugitives were generally men, but sometimes they were women. In one case, a man and a wife and a baby, about 4 months old, was with them. This happened to be in the Richards house. Now, George Richards is a favorite of mine because that's the south house of the museum where we have our hiding hole. And I had found this story before, but had no way to document it. There was a man and a woman and a young baby, and they had been in the home for a day and a half, and there were Southerners sitting across the street watching the Richards home. And finally, Mr. Richards said, I don't know what we're going to do if that baby keeps crying. So they went out into the garden. They gave the baby herbs, and that baby did not cry for 2 days until they were able to move them to the next safe house, which was over in Princeton. There's another story, and it takes place, and I'm telling you some of the stories I usually tell by our hiding hole. There were 2 men, and they had been in the basement of the museum. And they had been there 2.5 days, and they were waiting to be taken also. But the same thing happened, Mr. Richards' boarding house across the street. There were men sitting there watching and watching and watching, and finally Mr. Richards said to his wife, you better get your mourning clothes. And she said, why? She was afraid that they were going to come in and kill them, because if you were caught hiding slaves, remember, it was against the law, it was against the church, and you would be prosecuted for it. Mr. Richards would have been fined $1,000, which today would be equal to over $1 million. Mrs. Richards and her daughter Georgiana would have to leave the city of Geneseo and their lovely home. And so their whole lifestyle would change. So she thought something much more serious was going to happen to her. He said, no, just get your dresses and please bring them down to the basement. And she came down and he said, we need 2 of them. And she finally figured out what was going to happen. They dressed their 2 fugitives in the basement as 2 women in mourning, had their black dresses, their black veils over their faces. Mr. Richards was brave enough to put one on one arm, one on the other, walked them down the boardwalk right in front of the people who were searching for him, put them in the carriage and drive them out of town, and they never knew that those were the 2 men that they were searching for. Yay! So it's wonderful for me to be able to get the documentation that goes with this. Also, she turns and does the coming of the Allen brothers, which we discussed as well. To me, Harriet Cone Miller and the Cone family did so much for Geneseo and so much as the abolitionists. Next, I want to turn to our Allens, and Major Allen, James Allen, had a daughter named Sarah Allen. And Sarah Allen and Mary Ward were brought up from the Founding Fathers in 1836 as 2 young women too, as young abolitionists as well. And they had decided that they were teachers here. Now, Susanna Stewart Allen, John Allen's wife, was the first teacher in Geneseo. So her daughter, Susanna, had grown up with a teacher in her house her whole life. And you have to remember that James Allen's father in Alabama was also a preacher and a teacher. So she came from a line of teachers as well. And our first school only had 16 students. But Susanna helped her mother as well, or Sarah helped her mother Susanna as well. And she decided that she and Mary, after the Civil War, would go to the South and teach the Negro children, and that's their terms in here, to educate them. Now, this was not something that was looked upon as anything good if you were in Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama. These children were free, but they did not want to pay to have these children educated. They did not want them to have the jobs that their families were having, and they did not want anyone else to take those jobs. So they were very much against educating any of the young children. These two ladies, I can't imagine what it was like in 1891 to pack their bags and head out and head towards Alabama and Tennessee to teach these children. In 1905, when Sarah came back, she wrote a paper for the Geneseo Republic, and it talks about as a teacher of these young children, and also her reference with dealing with the Ku Klux Klan. And I won't get into all of this tonight, but how many people think we had Ku Klux Klan in Geneseo? Yes, we did. And we have papers, and we did have some photos at the museum, and I wanted to display them at one time. And those Ku Klux Klan pictures are missing from the museum. And it kind of hurts my feelings a little bit that I'm hoping that they were misplaced. But I, in my heart and soul, kind of think I doubt it. But it's all a part of history, and I think it's all very important because, as I said in the beginning, we can't change the past, but we can learn from it. Next is Experiences in the South, Tales of the Difficulties Met by the First Teachers of the Colored Race. Miss Sarah Allen of the city, while a teacher in South, following the Civil War, her pupils were colored boys and girls, and the consequences she came in touch with the Ku Klux Klan, of which she tells. The Republic is pleased to print the story, which cannot be of instructive reading to the present generations of readers, the larger proportions of readers and the larger proportions of whom have learned and read but little of these first efforts at educating the colored race, a work which has since been perfected, as was told to us by Dr. Booker T. Washington. Does anybody know that Booker T. Washington was here? He came with the Chautauqua, and I actually brought the paper to prove that as well. So here is Booker T. Washington's coming to Geneseo, Illinois. In the winter of 1891, Miss Mary Ward and myself went south to teach in the schools for the colored people under the auspices of the American Missionary Association, an arrangement being made by which we were to receive our pay in county script, as an effort to being made to the established public school system similar to that in the North. Northern men, or Yankees as they were called invariably in terms by the Southerners, were employed as county superintendents to introduce the system. Of course, this was very much against the desires of the Southern whites, who did not wish to be taxed for the support of the colored population. There was also a feeling that if they were educated, they would become more nearly on the same quality as their former masters. I recall very vividly my impressions of the journey, the change from snow and ice at home to rain as we reached Carroll, the slow trains as we trundled on through the heavy forests of Kentucky and Tennessee until we finally reached our destination in Aberdeen, Mississippi. We remained with Colonel Huggins, who was a superintendent of schools, and he was a nice young black man who had really instrumented the girls coming there. Mary finally was given a small white school near Okolona, and I went on to a very small place called Cotton Gin Port on the, I'm not sure I'm saying this, Tombigbee River. I have to look that up on my next travels there next fall. I found board and room in a house formerly owned by white people, but now was occupied by Aunt Melinda and her daughter. My schoolroom was directly on the banks of the river, without windows, only shutters, and slabs set up on legs for benches. Pigs and calves roamed about at their own sweet will beneath it. My pupils ranged from ABC tots up to a young man. Their favorite game was playing at baptism. It was their favorite pastime, or dancing, or patting their knees to keep time with the music as we sang. They seemed so eager to learn, very glad to get the pictures and small cards I would give them. I taught my class in the morning, Sunday school class as well, and the Negroes themselves holding services in the afternoon and in the evening. In spite of being very busy at work, the life was kept very lonely, one especially on evenings and Saturdays. I had not met a woman who formerly owned the house, left behind a pack of very ancient magazines. I should have fared much worse in that respect. Of course, I had frequent letters and papers from home, and no one can tell you the loneliness in a pine forest until set down in the midst of it, and there's longing to just have someone to talk to. One day I noticed a couple of men seated on the ground in front of my schoolroom playing cards, just near enough to see what was going on, but not near enough to disturb. I had heard of disturbances in the other part of the country. One lady teacher not far from me was warned by a letter from the Ku Klux Klan to leave her school, which she did, and others, mostly men, received the same warning. Colonel Huggins was at this time taken from a white man's house and given 100 lashes on his bare back with a saddle strap at the end of it. He was assured these were men of honor, that he should not be touched if he would only step outside in the yard. But as soon as he was able, he was sent to Washington, D.C. in the company of U.S. soldiers who had been sent to Aberdeen, the result being the final abolitionist of these night raiders. Had not felt uneasy for myself, for I was in the small, out-of-the-way place and did not much fear or anticipate any trouble. But after teaching 6 weeks, about the middle of March, I was awakened on a Saturday night by a loud pounding on my door and window. Upon immediately stepping to the window and asking what was wanted, I was told to dress, and they wished to talk to me. So I made an exceedingly hasty toilet, and I started to open the door, and for a moment I would not admit them. Then, in the answer in an unspoken prayer for help, the strength and the calmness came to me, and the trial was given to me. The captain of the Ku Klux Klan stepped in, saying, "Do not be alarmed, madam. Only the lieutenant shall come in and talk with you. The others shall remain without." I said, "Very well," and took my seat upon one side of the fireplace and the lieutenant on the other, whereupon he proceeded to point his pistol toward me, very much to my disgust. He began to put questions as to who I was, where I came from, what did I do before I came here, what my wages were, etc. I replied in the best of my ability. They seemed to be misinformed as to my salary. The whole extent of my scarcely amounted to $15 per month. He proceeded to talk upon the evils of allowing the colored people to be educated, said they were not willing to be taxed for the maintenance of the colored schools and were determined to break them up, and they certainly were not going to furnish them with pianos. He told me I must leave the place by Monday morning, or dire penalties would be visited upon my head. They would see that I would leave one way or another. Very much to my relief, the captain interposed and said that I could stay until Thursday, and then I could get away. He continued to talk about political lines for some time, asked me if I have heard of Colonel Huggins' punishment, and what I had thought of it, and I said, I heard of it, and I think it was extremely cruel to do to him. At last he remarked that they had come a very long distance and must be leaving, and wishing to know the time of night, I replied, I do not know. Whereupon a dozen or 15 men crowded into the room and stepped up. One finally looked at his watch and said, it is 2:00. And I said, gentlemen, if it's your business, if it's over with me, then I really think you should leave. I can't imagine a young girl having those guts. Then they went across the passageway to interview and intimidate Aunt Melinda, threatened to make the land flow with her blood, and to drive out every teacher from the North. Their language was even stronger, and I felt afraid that they would take her out and whip her too. I put my hand upon the doorknob to go out, when they went away, giving their renowned rebel yell and blood-curdling cry, sounds so scarcely meant to intimidate all the Negroes. Just as I succeeded in crawling into bed again, someone came back to my great distress, but informed me it was only to recover the pistol he had left on the shelf in my passageway. I heard them, among other things, to my Aunt Melinda, that I was a lady and I was not afraid of them, very much to my gratitude. The next morning, judging from the tracks that were left in the sand behind the house and the passageway, as well as the broken door sill, we concluded there must have been between 40 and 50 in the band. Their costumes and disguises were of white cloth, a gown and a mask, and the latter hanging loosely over their face, only a place so their eyes would be left open. Both captain and lieutenant wore, in addition, long horns of some material projecting over their forehead, quite a ridiculous outfit. I felt inclined to laugh at them as they turned to go away, for their gowns were well splashed with mud and water. An arrangement was made with a man to take me to Aberdeen on Thursday, as he was going there on business, for which he charged me $40. Can you imagine what that cost in equivalent to today? The Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of that week were very trying days. The hours dragged slowly by, and every night at 2 o'clock, I promptly woke and lived over and over again the scene of that visitation. So upon the appointed morning on Thursday, a little weasel, dried-up specimen of humanity with a smaller reproduction of himself drove up to Aunt Matilda's door, a wagon without a box, only some loose boards laid on it, and 2 very diminutive mules hitched to it. They threw my trunk and roped it on behind on the rush, and a rush-bottomed chair was placed in front for myself and the proprietor thereof, and his son sitting upon the board in front. The streams were very high at the time of the year, so the fording of them I obliged to crawl upon my trunk in order to get out of the water, and whenever we came to a hill of any size, we humans simply walked up while the mule, poor things, hauled up our wagons and trunks. The going down, however, was quite exciting. There'd be no holding back on the vehicle. As we were started down, it would race between the mules and ourselves as if to see who would arrive first. We came across a band of regular gypsies camped in the woods. They wanted to know if I was going on the journey. We were nearly all day reaching Aberdeen, perhaps 15 or 16 miles away. I remained in Colonel Huggins' home a few days, then took the train for Okalana, somewhere further north and west, where Mary Ward was hoarding the family of the positive master, Mr. Hall, and his wife, an excellent woman. Ward, teaching a colored school, and Mary, a young girl, completed the rest of the household. In the same house, a large old-fashioned mansion near the edge of town, lived Mr. and Mrs. Jeffries, formerly of Geneseo as well. I was warmly welcomed by these kind people, and also of the Shaddocks of Massachusetts, who later settled in Andover, Illinois. Collectors of Internal Revenue, Milo Ward, was also there and also came soon after. My father sent word by him for me to take the first train back to Geneseo, but I concluded to take a school in town left vacant by 2 young ladies from Pennsylvania who were obliged to return home on account of the death of their father. We often heard rumors of the coming of the Ku Klux Klan while here, and was followed home from school by 2 mean men. Our young men always carried weapons, and we never ventured to sit by an open window after dark or to go out into the streets. Once, after a sleepless night expecting a raid, I resolved to come home, but finally stayed until the close of the term on the 1st of June. Mary Ward's schoolhouse was burned to the ground, though built by that had been built by white planters for the use of their children. Speaking of the costumes of the Ku Klux Klan reminds me of some very weird questions asked to me exceedingly by a romantic young woman from Michigan who was staying at a time with Colonel Huggins, having applied to teach school as well. Her questions were of 3 in number, previously remarking that she wished she had been in my place, which indeed I wish she had been too. Number 1 question, did you look pale? I replied that I did not consult the mirror to see. Number 2, what was the fabric made of on the Ku Klux Klan's outfits? I said, as I did not examine them, I really cannot tell you. Her question number 3, how did you wear your hair? I said, certainly not in the latest style. I went on another year in Columbus, Mississippi to teach the primary department. Mr. Bishop, our superintendent, during my first year here, was interviewed by an investigating committee appointed by Congress to take the testimony in regard to the Ku Klux Klan raids Colonel Huggins had been given in his experience at Aberdeen, so I was obligated to recount mine before 3 U.S. senators and a reporter scribbling right under my nose. The name that recalls is Senator Blair of Missouri, though another was from Massachusetts and probably one from Ohio. During the 3 years of my teaching at Columbus, several principals had in charge of the school. Reverend Flavel Bascom, whose second wife was Mrs. Pomeroy from Geneseo, a teacher too here in early days. For 2 more years, my work continued. At Lamoille, Normal, and Memphis, Tennessee, Professor Steele, principal, is still in charge there at this time, a long and faithful service. Centennial year, I went east with my Aunt Sarah Allen, meeting her at Louis Wyeth, where I enjoyed a delightful visit. We came north, and I started from Jacksonville and attending the exposition at Philadelphia, spending Sundays in Washington en route. I had previously made arrangements with Alice Chapin, who we talked about last time, and Monica as well, who set up the manual labor school here in Geneseo, taught me how to study kindergarten under her instructions. I also learned to assist her in her work. Alice Chapin, another year in Indianapolis. Then during the next summer, Alice procured for me a situation in Fort Collins, Colorado at a high salary. I was obliged to train my own assistants, and over the average attendance was 75 or so. I was not idle in the least. The climate was invigorating, and I enjoyed my stay very much indeed. During the 3rd year, the sudden death of my father, James Allen, made my resignation a necessity. 3 years in Pontiac, Illinois, at the Reform School for Boys under Dr. Scholler, superintendent, and 6 weeks in New Orleans at Straight University, 6 months at Glenwood near Chicago, and during the World's Fair, and lastly, 1 year in kindergarten in Canton, Illinois. Closed up finally my career as a teacher. Sincerely, Sarah A. Allen, May 15th, 1905. What a credit to these young ladies. Having been a teacher for 22 years myself, I had it real easy. Our next meeting is going to be very important to us, too. We're going to meet here at the church, and we'll meet right outside if it's a nice evening. We're just going to, I have some fun things to tell you about the city park, about the Katies as well, and about our colonial sign. And then we're going to go to Jay and Judy Hansen's in Maplewood, and they're going to share with you their hiding area in their home, which I think is so kind of them to open up their house to us as well. And then we're going to visit the George Richards home, which is the museum, and see the hiding hole and other artifacts relating to the Underground Railroad that we have found there. I have a poster here, and I'm just going to hold it up here, but we're going to hear a little bit about Darlene Holland, of course, who is a member of this church. Her great-great-grandmother, Joanna Montgomery and Philip Montgomery, were our first freed black slaves brought to Geneseo. We all know Hammond Library and Hammond Henry Hospital, and it was John Hammond's family who went and freed them. He brought them back here to the house, to the land, right where Darlene Holland lives today. And he set the mother free, the father's free, but the little girl he didn't set free. And he knew when he did that the mother and the father would stay there and be his work on his land. He paid them. He built them a home, and that is still the home that Darlene Holland lives today. Also on display, we have the last will and testament of John Hammond, and in it he says he declares his slaves, Joanna and Philip Montgomery, free, and they can live on his land with great means from his estate as long as they wish. And his wife believed in servitude. And if upon his death, if things would change within their family, they could be taken back to her property on the Missouri-Illinois border and could be taken back to servitude. But as we well know, that never happened, which is very special to me. I also brought a couple other things to share that I usually don't bring out of our archives, but with so many people coming next week, I won't be able to. In a home in Geneseo, I was going through the rafters of their home, and in the floorboards, I found several things that I was kind of inquisitive about. And because, as I said, we can't change the past, I'm going to tell you the family. We all know Amy Bush and George Washington Shaw, who was our link to Abraham Lincoln, our Lincoln Room. And they were very proud of their heritage. They were sixth-generation cousins to Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island. They believed in anti-slavery. And Amy Bush always said to me, there's one thing I can say, Angie, my family were not slaveholders. Well, in the rafters of the floorboards of the original Shaw office that sat on South State Street across from the museum where our new library is, that house was moved across to the house that Amy lived on in front of Southwest School on Center Street. In the floorboards, I found this little burlap bag. I brought it back to the museum, and I opened it up very cautiously because I could tell it was very old. And inside of it were slave indentures. And they were to her family. And I know Amy would be disappointed, but I don't think she would ever behold it against me to share this with you. Bond for Negro for Hire, 1801. The original 1801 is right here. It's for a young girl, Hannah. And do we have very many children here? Well, Hannah was purchased by the plantation owner. And I mistakenly, at a time or so, have said that she was raped, but she was not. He owned her. She was 12 years old. He could do whatever he wanted to this young girl. Her servitude, her indention papers are very small. And it just says that she had a petticoat, 2 shifts. She had the customary clothing of a jacket. She had a summer jacket, a light petticoat, and a small blanket. This is from 1801. So if you wonder why I have such passion about this, this is why, because it happened. Also, we have 2 more. They're in the envelope. I do not have them framed. But this bond is for a Negro woman for hire from 1824 and for another young man from 1827. And they are in much larger spectrum. They have how many slashes were on their backs. They talked about their teeth, their dentures, their eyes, their ears, the stature, their teeth. When you were taken to a slave auction, you were hauled up here in front of everyone. And I do this in the schools. I pick a couple kids to stand up, and I tell them, we're going to have a slave auction day. You're going to see what this is like if you were a slave. And I asked them, if you were standing here, and I would never, ever do this, but I said, if you were at a slave auction, whether you were a child or an adult, you would be asked to take your top off. How humiliating. And show them your back, because if you had lots of lashes, you're not going to bring much money because you don't mind very well. The more slashes you have, the more that you rebelled, and the person who bought you, you're going to be shackled, you're going to be held to a wagon when you go into town. You're going to have a collar around your neck with 2 big hooks, so if you try to get away through the forests or through the cotton fields, you're going to get caught up. And if you are caught, do you know what's going to happen to you? And we're lucky in Geneseo. Our teachers do a wonderful job. I've been going to the schools for 13 years, and giving these talks, and they now have me come before they ever come through the museum. And almost all the children know I will get my leg broken or I'll get my foot broken. I may have 200 or 300 lashes, and if I'm caught and I'm taken back from Geneseo, I'm probably going to be beaten in front of every slave on the plantation, because I'm going to be the one who says, you don't want to do what I've just done. If that slave did not die within 2 days, he or she was hung. So when I found these, I thought, oh, we have to be so proud of our Geneseo people in taking the stand they have. I have one more thing to share, and I have two more things. I've gone a little over tonight, but I think I was pretty inspired today. Today, our keynote speaker made a statement that really stuck with me, and he said, we stand up every day. Our children say the Pledge of Allegiance every day. How many times do they really stop and think when we say the pledge, we say with liberty and justice for all? That means everyone. And I thought about that all the way home, and I thought, the next time I'm going to borrow his statement, and I will give him the credit for it because that's where I got it. But I want the children to remember, when their hands on their heart, they need to remember liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You were good listeners. Thank you.
Next week we meet here then?
Yes, just meet here in front of the church, and if anybody needs a ride, I will have my van, and I'm sure other people, I'm going to kind of arrange so that we do have extra rides if anyone else has a van and you don't mind going to Judy's house or to the museum. And we'll meet here at the city park first. I will point out William T. Allen's house and several other houses that were part of the Underground Railroad that are still standing. Then we'll head out to Judy and Jay's, and then we'll come to the museum, and then we'll come back here for refreshments. And then the following week will be the last one in our Lenten services, and that will be Owen Mulder, and he will give you just a wonderful insight of all of this area, Galesburg, Knox, Weathersfield, Andover, Cambridge, Geneseo as well. So thank you.
Been looking at different angles of the Underground Railroad, and I appreciate all of you for your attendance and participation, and most of all I want to thank those who have been our speakers at these programs, and also for Gail Desher, who's the chair of our Board of Deacons, who's really instrumental in putting all this together. Gail is in the back. Please give her a big hand for. But I also want to thank all the members of the Board of Deacons, because they're the ones that have provided all the refreshments and making sure everything is flowing smoothly, and they've just done a fantastic job. And again, I just want to thank you for observing Lent with us by learning about the history not only of this congregation, but also of Geneseo. And tonight, I am delighted to be able to present to you Mr. Owen Mulder. He is currently the director of the Galesburg Colony Underground Railroad Freedom Center at Knox College. It's also a Freedom Station affiliate of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati. And he has been the director of the Freedom Center at Knox since 2004. Is that correct? And when he retired as the college's alumni director after working at Knox for, 36 years, so you have about 43 years affiliated with Knox College. And he is a graduate of Knox College. He also went and got a graduate degrees at University of Miami in Ohio. And again, he came back to Knox College and has been a part of Knox College in a a variety of roles. He has been a director of various programs. Also, you've worked with students as dean, different aspects of. So you must know Knox College inside and out. And his father was H.R. Milder, and some of you might be familiar with him. He's a renowned historian. Was a renowned historian at Knox College for many years, and he wrote a book back in '59. That was entitled "Fighters for Freedom," which examined the religious, political, and educational beliefs of the anti-slavery activists who founded Galesburg and Knox College. Well, tonight, Owen is going to be, his presentation will be in 3 parts. The first will be about the Underground Railroad, sort of a general overview of the Underground Railroad. And then he will take us on a little tour of the Underground Railroad in Illinois. And then he will finish with the Underground Railroad here in Geneseo. And following his presentation, you'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers. And then, as always, you're invited to go downstairs into our fellowship hall where we got plenty of refreshments for you. So again, it's my privilege to introduce Owen Milder from Knox College.
Thanks. Thank you.
I did forget one thing. He is the author of a book that he has here, and it's about the Underground Railroad here in Western Illinois. He has some copies available, and he's also you just turned in your manuscript for a second book about the Anti-Slavery Society.
Right.
And so we look forward to that book coming out as well.
Okay. Gee, thanks. Good evening. Push this away because I have on this mic. Can you hear me? Well, delighted to be here, and thank you, Reverend, and Gail, and Angie, and other friends here, the Murphys. Before I finish tonight, I want to make sure at least of one thing, and that is that all of you who are not aware of this already will leave tonight fully aware that Geneseo, in terms of its ties to the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad, was just not another town in the United States. In fact, Geneseo was a particularly important anchor on the western edge of the anti-slavery movement, all the way up until the Civil War. So I hope that before I'm finished tonight, I can elaborate on that. Well, I want to talk tonight very briefly, and my wife's here, so she has the advantage of sitting in the back and reminding me if I get going too long on something to get me going. I want to talk, though, very briefly about the anti-slavery movement in the United States, and then, as has been indicated, talk to you about the Underground Railroad in the United States, talk about that subject in Illinois, and then end up very specifically talking about Geneseo in this locale in reference to those subjects. And the reason I want to begin with the anti-slavery movement in general is I hope that by doing that I can give you a much better frame of reference when we get into the part of my remarks that are a little more specific, so that maybe that will all make a little more sense to you, or at least I hope so. The United States, which established itself as a model of democracy to the world, something that we're all very proud of as Americans, unfortunately had, as most of you know, one major flaw when the country was launched. And that was, despite the fact that we held ourselves up to the world as a model of freedom, liberty and justice for all, that was true for everyone but slaves. So the great flaw, at least in my view, that the United States lives with during the first 70, 75 years of our nation's history was struggling with this problem, the slavery issue. And in fact, if you look at American history, from the time the country is launched, about 1790 until the end of the Civil War, America is constantly coming back and forth, up and down, trying to address the slavery question. There were people who were, from the very beginning of our nation's founding, and even before, when we were colonies, there were people and a few organizations who tried to bring down the institution of slavery in our land. But the anti-slavery movement doesn't really begin to cohere or crystallize, come together in a significant way until the 1830s. Slavery, of course, had become crucial to the American economy for a number of reasons, but the primary reason had to do with cotton. Cotton laid the great wealth of the United States. In fact, in my view, the wealth that cotton generated in the 19th century still resonates today in terms of the foundation of what happened then in terms of making America such a wealthy nation. My youngest daughter is an actress, and when Lori and I go around the country to watch Caitlin perform, we have a chance to go to different parts of the nation. And when she was a young actress, she was at the Southern Shakespeare Festival, and we were driving down to Oxford, Mississippi to see her. And we stopped by a gas station, and while we were getting gas, I walked over the edge of the gas station where there was a cotton field. And I picked one handful of cotton because I wanted to test what I had always studied. And in one handful of cotton, you wouldn't believe how many seeds there were. In just one little handful. And of course, before the cotton gin was invented, somebody, usually a slave, had to pick those seeds out one at a time. And it took a slave in a normal work day, a slave could process maybe 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of cotton a day. But after the cotton gin was invented, all of that changed dramatically. Now, I know all of us were taught in school that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. It will not surprise the women in the room to know that really a woman invented the cotton gin. But it will not be the first or last time that a man gets credit for something that a woman has done. It was invented by a woman by the name of Catherine Green. Whitney was on her property in South Carolina, and she said, here's the problem with the seeds, here's the kind of machine that you need, here's how it should be built, here's how it should work. I call that inventing. It was a remarkable machine. You simply take the cotton that's been picked from the field, you dump it on the top of the machine. It looked a little bit like what you're looking at here. And you would turn a crank, and the crank would rotate, and off that rotator there were prongs that would knock the seeds out. And there was a little combing screen below that would brush the seeds away. You'd pick the cotton back up, you'd do that 5 or 6 times, and the cotton was clean. Well, after these first cotton gins were invented, a slave could process 45, maybe 50 pounds of cotton a day. Southerners therefore did what? They cleared more land, planted more cotton, and needed more slaves. So cotton becomes the great generator of Americans' wealth. And where was that cotton that was grown in the South sent? To textile mills in the North. To New York City, that becomes the great broker of cotton in the world. And across the ocean, to France and to England. So everyone in the United States, by the time you get to the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, everybody in the United States, North and South, was benefiting from the wealth that cotton generated. Okay, so along come people throughout these years, as I indicated earlier, who are not happy, however, with the institution of slavery in the United States. And they are people who want to abolish slavery, and they come to be called abolitionists. And these abolitionists were considered by most people as troublemakers. They were threatening the wealth of the nation. And for the most part, most Americans thought of them as fanatics and, as I said, troublemakers. Okay. As I said again a moments earlier, by the time you get into the 1830s, enough of these people are becoming together to get organized. And in 1833, in Philadelphia, in December of 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society is established, a national society to try to bring slavery to an end in America. And what do national societies do? They form state societies, right? All of you who belong to national groups. And what do state societies do? They form local societies. And so the American Anti-Slavery Society then became so well organized that they started establishing auxiliary societies in various northern states and in New England. And one of the things that they did, they learned fairly soon after 1833, was that in addition to sending out pamphlets and anti-slavery almanacs and newspapers advocating anti-slavery principles, they started to hire agents, full-time speakers who they paid to go into communities from Maine to Indiana, lecturing against slavery and helping to organize these local societies. And before I'm done tonight, one thing that you'll be sure to know is that one of the most important one of these agents comes to Geneseo. And in fact, he lived right across the street, and his name was William T. Allen. William T. Allen is one of my heroes. He's an example of a person who dedicated his life to bringing down the institution of slavery. I'll get to him in a little more detail later. Okay. There were people then who decided to stand up against slavery, as I've identified, that we called abolitionists. But there were people who decided to take an even more radical step than just standing up against slavery. They were people who attached themselves to the Underground Railroad. You might be an abolitionist, and by the way, there weren't even many abolitionists, but you might be an abolitionist and say, I'm opposed to slavery, I think the United States should get rid of it. That's one thing, but it was a much more radical step to involve yourself in the Underground Railroad, because if you involved yourself in the Underground Railroad, you were going so far as to actually break the law. The very same year that the cotton gin gets its patent in 1793 is the very same year that the United States Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Law. And George Washington signs the bill making it a national law, illegal to help slaves escape. The South really wanted it, and Congress gave it to them. So you could be an abolitionist, but a much smaller group of people said, we're actually willing to break the law in order to help slaves escape. Now, the Underground Railroad is a term that came to be used across the United States. And why was it called railroad? Why did they think to use that term? Well, I believe that what the cotton gin was to the 18th century in America, and what computers were to the 20th century in America, railroads were to the 19th century. Railroads changed America more profoundly than any other machine or invention at that time. And so the term Underground Railroad was a term that was used because railroads were so popular, a means of transportation, and underground. And I'll just remind you that the Underground Railroad didn't actually go into the ground and under the ground, as some third or fourth graders sometimes ask me. But it then became the term that was used, and we are fairly sure that the first time the term was used was as a result of an incident in northern Kentucky and southern Ohio. A fugitive slave by the name of Tice Davids had escaped from his owner. He was being chased down by his owner and slave trackers. Slave owners hired detectives or slave trackers to go after runaway slaves. Incidentally, they had very well-trained scent dogs. They were called Negro dogs, who were trained for no other purpose than to go after fugitive slaves. And brother, if you were a fugitive slave and got caught by these dogs, you would get torn up. In any case, Tice Davids is escaping. He gets to the Ohio River. He can see Ohio across the river, a free state. He's in Kentucky, a slave state. He's almost caught, and somehow, some way, they lose track of him. And his owner was furious. He went to the Cincinnati newspapers and the Louisville newspapers and said, "We almost had this runaway slave." It was as if he escaped underground. And we think that the term comes from that story in the early 1830s. Now, the Underground Railroad heads out away from the southern states in every direction. Most people are aware of the fact that there were Underground Railroad locations in northern states. Fugitive slaves were held by these Underground Railroad operators, as they were oftentimes heading to Canada, heading north. But in fact, the Underground Railroad heads out to the south in every direction. It heads into the Caribbean Sea. It goes into Arkansas and Texas and goes down into Mexico. It extends as far west as California. Fugitive slaves oftentimes would hide as stowaways on ships that they knew were heading along the Atlantic seaboard northward to the ports of Boston and New York and other cities in the east. But without a question, the most extensive network of Underground Railroad locations did exist in the north, and almost every northern state. Fugitive slaves, of course, for the most part, had no idea where they were when they ran away. Most of them had lived almost all of their lives on the plantations or farms where they were slaves. They had very little idea, once they took off, how they could get away, or how they could get away was to run away, but they weren't always sure where they were. But there were a few things that people in those days knew about getting your bearings that were common to almost all people. My dad used to say, if you can't navigate Owen by the stars at night, you're really not well educated. Well, that would be me. I can't do that very well. But this we do know. We know that in those days, before television and movies and iPods and computers and all sorts of other gadgets I don't even understand, we know that people were fascinated at night by looking at the stars. The stars were great entertainment. They were free. And people knew a great deal in those days about how to negotiate by the stars. And of course, one of the most basic ways to find where you were if you lived in the United States or Canada was to find Polaris, the North Star. You couldn't do it tonight, it's going to be cloudy, and you couldn't do it in Geneseo on any night when there's lights around. But if you were to drive 5 or 6 miles outside of Geneseo on a clear night, it's not too far, or too hard rather, to find the Big Dipper. And if you go along the Big Dipper's 2 top stars and go directly towards the Little Dipper, a much smaller dipper, the last star on the Little Dipper is Polaris. It's the North Star. And if you find the North Star, you are always heading northward if you walk towards it. Fugitive slaves also knew this much, that every creek and river and stream in this part of the country, in Illinois and Iowa, eventually empties into what? The Mississippi. And they knew that if you went against the current of any river or stream, it might zigzag and weave around, but you were always heading northward. And there were some other things that they also knew about how to find their shadow and so on. Okay. Real freedom was not achieved if you were a runaway slave until you got to Canada. But many, many fugitive slaves decided to take the risk of staying within the United States. And we know that some fugitive slaves who got into Canada found the climate so unpleasant that they wanted to come back a little farther south and try to make it in the States. But that was risky business, because at any time, if you were a runaway slave, you could be pursued, caught, taken back by these slave trackers or detectives, or even some average person who knew that somebody who had not seen in their region, who was a black man or woman, might very well be a fugitive slave. They might see that there was a reward out for them, and they wanted to cash in and get the money. So it was risky business if you chose to stay within the United States, but many fugitive slaves did. This was courageous business. If you were a runaway slave, you, as I said, had a lot of trouble knowing where even you were. You usually only had the clothes on your back. You might have a small knapsack or bag with a little bit of food in it. And you were struggling to even survive. Now, one of the things that was particularly unusual about the Underground Railroad where we live, in western Illinois, right here in Geneseo and Galesburg, Macomb, Quincy, those communities, as well as the communities of Iowa, was that in those days, the landscape was dominated by prairie grass. And there are 3 basic kinds of prairie grass, short, medium, and tall, and there's 43 strains. But the tallest prairie grass in the world is big blue stem. I wouldn't be surprised if some people have some big blue stem in their yard. And big blue stem could grow as high as 6, 6.5, in certain summers, under the right conditions, as high as 7 feet tall. So it turns out that fugitive slaves in this part of the country literally could, from the middle of summer on, disappear into this grass. The Underground Railroad was not as prevalent in southern and eastern Illinois as it was in western and northern Illinois. And the reason for that is that Illinois is 385 miles long. If you go along the top border of Illinois and you go directly eastward, you'll hit New Hampshire. And if you go to the southern tip of Illinois, Cairo, and go directly eastward, you'll hit Virginia. So Illinois' southern counties, Illinois' southern regions are the first to be substantially populated by white Americans. They follow the Ohio River as a natural highway westward. And those southern Illinois counties tended to be settled by Southerners, and they were pro-slavery. And even though Illinois came into the Union, it was required to under the Northwest Ordinance as a free state. Many counties in southern Illinois tolerated slavery. The sheriff, the judges, the legal authorities allowed it to exist. Where we live, in western Illinois and in northern Illinois, those parts of Illinois are settled later. And they're settled by Yankees. They're settled by New Englanders and New Yorkers. And believe me, there was a really major difference between the people then who were residing in southern Illinois and northern Illinois. And in the middle of the state, those two cultures clashed. People in southern Illinois tended to have a little more kind of what we might call down-home religion. They liked to drink. Okay? They had a much more laid-back lifestyle. They didn't quite worry as much always about taking a bath. These Yankees were quite different. My kids would have said they were uptight. Okay? They certainly dressed differently. They certainly had a much more formal religious set of practices. They tend to be overwhelmingly Presbyterians and Congregationalists, a good number of Methodists, a little later on Lutherans. And they were opposed, most of them, to the consumption of alcohol. The people who come to Galesburg and the people who come to Geneseo then are very strict practicing Christians. And they attach themselves to the temperance movement. The temperance movement was a movement in the 19th century that leads to prohibition in the 20th century. This was a group of people who were opposed to the consumption of alcohol. They thought that when you consumed it, your behavior was irrational and goofy and you got drunk and embarrassed yourself. But they also knew that women's rights and children's rights then were so limited that men got drunk and beat the daylight sometimes out of the women and the children around them. The temperance movement was a very, very strong reform movement in the 19th century, and the people who came to this town were part of it. And the third thing these people were was vehemently anti-slavery. Okay? They interpreted the Bible to say that slavery was a sin, and that settled it for them. You know, they didn't need Chris Matthews or Bill O'Reilly to tell them what to think. Okay? They read the Bible, and they interpreted the Bible to say that it was against Christ's teaching to hold somebody in bondage. Okay. You have this very different set of people, even though they're all living in Illinois then, between people who were living in the southern and eastern, southeastern parts of Illinois as compared to the central, western, and northern regions. My dad used to have an old expression that was, as the crow flies, meaning on a straight line. As the crow flies from Galesburg, we were only about 90 miles from slavery. You tend to think, rightfully, when you're growing up, slave states in the south, free states in the north, and that was true. But in Galesburg, we're about 90 miles. From Geneseo, you're probably only about 120, 125 miles southeast, very close to the state of Missouri, and Missouri was a slave state. So not surprisingly, that's why through this region of where we live, there were a number of runaway slaves who were escaping from Missouri. And the other reason there were a lot of slaves who were trying to get away coming through this region was because of the Mississippi and the Illinois River. There were so many barges and steamboats by this time that slaves were used for every conceivable job on the river. As deckhands, as maids, as valets, as cooks, as barbers. So many fugitive slaves who were coming through this region waited till these river crafts would get north or close to the Iowa, Illinois, Missouri border and would take the risk of escaping. In western Illinois, the three most important satellite stations were in Quincy, Galesburg, and Princeton. But right after that, I would have to say, is Geneseo and Farmington and Canton. All 6 of those communities became very important Underground Railroad locations. Quincy's right across the river from Missouri. And in Quincy, there was a famous underground, a number of operators that had quite a reputation. But one of them was a man by the name of Dr. David Nelson. And Dr. David Nelson had a school called the Mission Institute in Quincy. And in Quincy, at that school, he had 3 of his students one night cross the Mississippi River and take the incredible risk of going into Missouri to actually get slaves out and bring them into Illinois, and they got caught. Thompson, Work, and Burr. This is a little sketch of them in a Missouri prison. They're captured, they're indicted, they're sent off to the Missouri Penitentiary. One of them gets out after about 3.5 to 4 years, one around 4. Thompson is there until had been in jail there for about 5 years, till he was finally released. You move out of Quincy and you head up to Galesburg. Well, Galesburg was founded by George Washington Gale. Gale had started a school in New York called the Oneida Institute. And following the pattern that was very common in American history in the 19th century, many people who had established themselves and had a good life going in the East would pull up roots and head west. And Gale comes out to Illinois with a colony of people, followers, and establishes Galesburg and Knox College at the same time. They're the same people. And it establishes itself right off the bat as this very, very radical anti-slavery Underground Railroad town. And there were more lines coming in from the Underground Railroad to Galesburg than any other town, at least in southern Illinois. Chicago eventually becomes the most important Underground Railroad city, but initially Galesburg was. And the next major hideout or station was over in Princeton. And some of you might have had an occasion to go to Princeton at some point recently or some years ago. And you, if you do go to Princeton, can visit the house that still stands there of Owen Lovejoy. Owen Lovejoy was the most famous of any Underground Railroad operator in Illinois. Owen Lovejoy's brother, Elijah P. Lovejoy, was an anti-slavery man who was killed by an anti-slavery mob in Alton in 1837. And as he is dying, killed by this mob, his brother Owen leans down and announces to everyone present that he'll take up his cause. and in honor of his brother, and he did. And he moves in 1838 to Princeton, and I don't think that was by accident. By then, Quincy was established, Galesburg was just getting started, Geneseo was just getting started, okay? And he goes to Princeton, and I think it was intentionally to place himself along this line that was heading northeast towards Chicago in Canada. Okay. Southeast of Geneseo is the town of Toulon, Stark County. And in Stark County, there was an incredibly important Underground Railroad operator. You can't see him very well. His name was Samuel G. Wright. Samuel G. Wright was sent out as a trustee from Knox. The trustees of Knox College sent him out as a kind of missionary. And when he was settling in Stark County and really working for Gale and Knox as a missionary in the region, he started keeping a diary. To a person that does what I do, I spend my life studying this and watching the St. Louis Cardinals, not always in that order, okay? And Samuel G. Wright is a wonderful example to me of a person who is a legitimate hero. He leaves Galesburg, he goes up to West Jersey Township, and then he settles in the town of Toulon, and he starts writing this diary. I've read every word he ever wrote in that diary, and everything he ever wrote about the anti-slavery movement or the Underground Railroad, I have written down. He has these wonderful quotes in his diary about helping fugitive slaves escape. July 26, 1847. Saturday, a black man from slavery came here, and I carried him on the public highway and in daylight in the middle of the day to the next station. The reason he makes a big deal about the daylight is that slaves were only usually taken at night. June 11th, 1848. I brought a colored man and took him to Hiram Roads in town, and he went on to Osceola. It's a little town, a little spot that's barely there now. The next day, they put him on a stage to Princeton. Listen to this one. July 24th, 1854. On Friday, 5 fugitives came here who had escaped from their master. On Friday, 5 fugitives came here who had escaped from their master in Fremont County, Iowa, as he was taking them from Mississippi to Salt Lake. I carried them to Esquire Otten's. They were intelligent for men who could not read. One of them said to me that he would not be taken back alive, for he had determined on liberty or death for him. Wright goes off into West Jersey Township. Nobody wants anything to do with him at first. Only a few people will even talk to him. That's in 1840, and he slowly starts to win people over. And 14 years later, he's sitting in the church that he helped build in Toulon, and he's not saying a word. He's sitting in the front row, but he has nothing to do with what's about to happen. And the deacons and the elders of the church get up and read a statement that says, this Congregationalist church will not abide anyone who supports slavery. We will not support anybody at all who is even reads or pro-slavery publications, and we will not give them the sacrament. Well, I could go on, but my wife's already giving me the signal. And I want to talk to you, of course, here at the end about Geneseo. As most of you know, Geneseo is a community that is settled, Galesburg and Geneseo are parallel communities. The people that came to Galesburg were from Oneida area, the Utica area. The people who came to Geneseo came from Western New York, and of course they came here under the leadership of Reverend Wilcox, who was a Yale graduate. These people were followers of Charles G. Finney, and if you've attended any of these lectures earlier, I know that Finney has probably been alluded to. He was one of the great leading figures of the so-called Great Revival or the Second Great Awakening, a great evangelical religious movement that sweeps across America in the 19th century. Finney and the people from this movement offer the average person something that the old Calvinists didn't offer. The old Calvinists said only a select few of very special people are ever worthy of going to heaven. Finney said, no, you're all worthy. Everybody that can hear my voice can go to heaven if you will become a committed Christian and dedicate your life to benevolent good works. The people who come to Geneseo are followers of Finney. In fact, as I understand it, some of the early sermons that are delivered in the Congregational Church in Geneseo are taken pretty much directly from sermons that Finney had delivered. So this town becomes a very, very powerful Underground Railroad abolitionist community with strong ties to Galesburg. The people who were connected in these two towns, they shared a physician, they shared a music director. The music director from Galesburg would come up and do the music in the church here and go back to Galesburg. Strong ties between the two of them. Well, you remember I told you way back when I started about Theodore Weld and his anti-slavery people. I was talking about the American Anti-Slavery Society. I should mention something. Excuse me, I don't think I gave you enough information. I need to talk just briefly about this man, Weld. When the American Anti-Slavery Society starts, one of their leaders is Theodore Weld, and he sends out anti-slavery speakers, lecturers across New England and New York. They paid these guys full time to go out and help organize these societies and speak. Weld is the great leader. One of his famous 70, he collected around him, this is what my new book's about mostly, about these lectures. One of them was William T. Allen. William T. Allen and James Allen are born in Alabama. Their father's a slave owner. As young men, they go off to Cincinnati. And in Cincinnati, there was the Lane Seminary, a minister's training school. Theodore Weld goes out to this school with a lot of other young men from New York. And they have a famous debate about slavery at the school in 1834, where most of these young kids at this school, these young men, become radicalized about slavery. Allen is elected as the president of their Student Anti-Slavery Society. And frankly, it rocked the boat in Cincinnati. What they were doing was not very popular. They started establishing a black Sunday school, teaching blacks. They had a small school to teach blacks how to read. Started attending black weddings and funerals. And to make a long story short, the trustees at the school said, calm down, take it easy. You're going to have to get rid of your Student Anti-Slavery Society. And Weld and almost all the students, including William T. Allen, say, goodbye, we're leaving. They leave Lane, they go north to Oberlin. And Oberlin College becomes the most important institution of higher learning associated with the anti-slavery movement. And it happens because of these kids, young men, going up to Oberlin and continuing to commit themselves to this movement. Allen goes with them. Allen graduates from Oberlin, and after he graduates from Oberlin, Weld says, come and be one of my agents, one of the 70. He goes to New York and almost kills himself delivering these lectures. These guys had just very unrealistic ideas of what they could do. They tried to speak night after night, day after day. Allen really drives himself into the ground the way most of them did. He finally has to leave this group of agents. The American anti-slavery, for a lot of reasons I don't have time to get into tonight, gradually fades away and the movement becomes political. The Liberty Party, Free Soil Party, which becomes the Republican Party in the 50s, is established. So Allen then comes to Illinois, and he becomes an agent for the Illinois State Anti-Slavery Society, and he lectures throughout Illinois. He's almost killed one night by a mob in Peoria. In the meantime, while he's doing this, his brother James comes right here. Their father gave him somewhere between $700 to $800 to buy land here. Wilcox and these people are coming out from New York. Allen happens to be looking for land. They hook up, and Allen becomes an early, important member of this community. Allen sets himself up, and it's not long then after that, in the late 1830s, before William T. Allen settles here in Geneseo. His wife dies, and he remarries a woman by the name of Chapin. And after the Civil War is well over, a scholar by the name of Wilbur Siebert wrote the first major book on the Underground Railroad in 1898. And his daughter writes this wonderful letter to Siebert about what her father was engaged in. And she says at one point, here, let me read just one part of this to you. Mr. Siebert, I have tried my best to give you information. Have written my sister in Utah and other friends to remind me of information. But I fear I cannot tell you very definitely all the stories of the road through here. In 1843, Father Allen goes to Peoria, and I won't read that part. That's where he's mobbed. But she goes on to say that her father is not treated very well, that he's not very popular, that his involvement with the Underground Railroad leads to all sorts of incidents where his family is harassed and he has eggs and brick bats thrown at him. But she also says that he starts to make a lot of progress with the help of Reverend Wilcox. Other men that he was involved with here were, among many others, Roderick Stewart, E.M. Stewart, also the Cone family. And they start to get to the point where they get a little more daring about their Underground Railroad activities. Finally, in the 1850s, she writes that once the real railroads have started to snake out of Chicago, first to Mendota and then to Princeton, then to Galesburg, and then the CB&Q would split. One arm of the railroad went to Burlington, the other to Quincy. She writes in this letter to Siebert that they start putting fugitive slaves on real railroad trains. So there's an irony that they used all these terms of Underground Railroad, and then finally when the real railroads come, they actually are putting fugitive slaves on real tracks, on real trains. And of course, there's a whole host of Underground Railroad operators around Geneseo that support one another. There's Samuel G. Wright, who I read to you about down in Toulon. Owen Lovejoy, who I alluded to over in Princeton. There's an important Underground Railroad community just south of here in the small communities of Cambridge and Andover, and over in the Quad Cities as well. So there gets to be this network. These people knew very well who one another were. To use the old expression, I guess you could say that they were in cahoots. Allen, of course, then starts to also become, not surprisingly, such a good friend of Owen Lovejoy that Owen Lovejoy in the mid-1850s, who's running this very openly, has this house that people know where he hides fugitive slaves. Lovejoy decides to run first for the state legislature, and then he starts to make the decision to run for Congress. And in the mid-1850s, he's elected to the United States House of Representatives. In the 1860s, one day, he meets Theodore Weld, who I told you about. And Lovejoy says to Weld, the main reason that I was elected to congressman as an abolitionist from Illinois was William T. Allen, who had abolitionized the district. Lovejoy dies before the Civil War is over. Well, I've gone on altogether too long, and I've gotten 3 signals from my wife. I would like her to talk to me on the way back to Galesburg. So, any of you that want to stay around later, I will give the 4-hour lecture. But with that, I will say thank you very much and take a few questions. But thank you, I appreciate it. Maybe this will be like English class, and there will not be any hands raised. Mostly Moline. Yeah, there was a question in the Quad Cities. Mostly it was Moline, and there was a man by the name of Evan Smith. There was another man who started very briefly an anti-slavery newspaper, but not many people bought it, so he had to give up and move away. And the reason that it's important is, and this is another reason Geneseo was so crucial, remember what I said about rivers? Well, you're not far from the Rock River here. And of course, fugitive slaves sometimes, when they would get to off the Mississippi or even had escaped through northern Missouri and come through southern Iowa or across Iowa, would get to the Rock River, and they would be told or would learn that all you had to do is follow the course of that river, and of course that, as you know, bends and goes north through Rockford. So there were also the little towns of Albany. I don't know if you know, there was the Crosby family up by Albany. And so there weren't as many operators there, actually, as there were in Galesburg and Geneseo. River towns were trouble. Peoria, where Allen was mobbed, I told you he was almost killed one night in 1843. River towns had some educated people, churches, ministers, people who were enlightened, but it also had a pretty rough and tumble, what I guess I'd call riverfront element, who didn't think much of abolitionists, swindlers and gamblers and people who were looking for a reward. So fugitive slaves had to be very careful in a town like Peoria, Quincy, or the river towns of the Quad Cities. Yes, way back. Some of them did. Owen Lovejoy was indicted once, but he beat the rap, I should say beat the charge, in court. Samuel G. Wright was indicted once. In Galesburg, Illinois, Gale once was indicted. There's a very famous case in Galesburg where a fugitive slave by the name of Susan Richardson comes into Galesburg with her 3 children and another slave woman. And she had not escaped from a slave state. She had escaped from one of these counties in southern Illinois that I told you about where slavery was tolerated. They get into Knox County and they're caught. They're taken to the sheriff's office and to the jail in Knoxville, Illinois. And the abolitionists in Galesburg, those troublemakers over at Knox College, were still like that down there, went over and more or less said to the sheriff, you can't prove that this woman's a slave. What evidence do you have? So her slave owner, so-called owner, a man by the name of Borders, comes up from Randolph County in Illinois. A lot of legal haggling goes on back and forth, And the sheriff says to her, I'll let you out of jail and let your kids out of jail and this other woman if you'll promise to stay in the area till the court hearing is over. And she gets out. Her name is Susan. She becomes known as Aunt Sukie Richardson. Slaves, when they escaped, oftentimes made money in a free state based upon what they had done as a slave. If they were a bricklayer when they were a slave, they became a bricklayer. If they were a barber, they were a barber. She did laundry. She starts living in Knoxville, makes enough money that while this is going on, that she gets her own place to live, and Borders comes back. He comes back with faulty legal evidence, but he comes back with a big barrel of whiskey. And they get the posse and the sheriff drunk, and they go get her kids. And they figure that the mother will what? Come to her children, right? Again, the Galesburg abolitionists hear this is going on. They go to her and say, hey, don't give yourself up. More often than not, when slaves ran away, their slave owners said, I don't want this to happen again. I'm going to sell them off and make my money before I lose them again. And as gut-wrenching as that decision had to be for her, she didn't give up. They disguised her in Knoxville, which is close to Galesburg. It was starting to snow that night. They put her in a sleigh and took her to Galesburg where she was safe. Galesburg was such a radical anti-slavery town that I have never found one case of a fugitive who got into Galesburg and was returned to slavery. She becomes a fairly prominent citizen in Galesburg, but she never saw those kids again. Right here. I couldn't hear the first part of what you said. Oh, the volume? We don't know. My sister's husband's a statistician, and when I started to try to get into that, he convinced me that the body of evidence is so sketchy that I better just stay away from it. We don't have very good estimates. But we do know this, that in southern Canada, there became all-black communities, Buxton, and St. Catharines. And one way that I can study this is I can study it from where I found the slaves escaped. I can start there. Or you can go to Canada and come backwards. Okay, let's have some cookies. Thank you.